Good morning, everyone. It's actually a gorgeous day out, and I am going to go ahead and get started. We still have people filtering in, but I wanted to start out by saying that typically when I engage in these types of presentations, they're in person. So this will be an interesting exercise to go through all of this somewhat heavy material over through a virtual training. So I'm excited about that. Just a few housekeeping things. If you have any questions throughout, and I really do encourage questions because the more questions there are, the more robust the training will be and the more that we can all learn from each other. So just a few, also like when I typically do these trainings, we also do some norms or some ground rules. And so since we're not all in a room together, I just wanted to say that I'm open to any question that anybody has as long as it's asked respectfully. I will be putting myself out there and using myself as an example at times. And I just want to say right from jump that I do that very consensually, and that I am placing myself in a role where I'm open to where I'm being open. But some of the things I might share might not be things that would be appropriate to ask someone else. And we'll dig more into that as we go through this, but I just wanted to say that from the outset. So I really do encourage questions. And if you want to ask a question during this, you can just put your question in the question pane, and then Torlin from All Chicago will be able to read those questions out loud to me, and I'll go ahead and answer them. So periodically I'll say, hey, Torlin, any questions? And then Torlin will let me know and read those questions out loud, and I'll be able to answer them. I do also want to start out with a little background about myself so that you know why I'm sitting here talking to you all about this. And like I said, typically I'm doing this at a room full of people that are actually looking at me engaged. So right now I'm looking at a computer screen. But I do want to just say that, just give you a little bit about my background. And normally I would also have everyone go around and say their name and the pronouns that they use. But we have over 100 people registered for this webinar. And so that would take a very long time for us to all write that in the chat box. So I'll go ahead and just do it for myself. So my name is Avi Rudnick. I use he, him pronouns. I am the director of scattered site housing at Chicago House. I also am the co-coordinator of the name change mobilization through the Transformative Justice Law Project of Illinois. So I'm both an attorney and a social worker. I started out my career as an attorney as a public defender in Portland, Oregon. And then I moved back to Chicago in 2010, where I engaged with the Transformative Justice Law Project, which is a law project that a friend of mine in law school in New York came up with this idea. And then he hit the ground running with it in 2008. And when I moved back to Chicago in 2010, I got involved, and I've been doing that ever since. And I am soon to shift out of my role with them as a name change mobilization co-coordinator and join the board. So that just gives you some background into me and the type of work that I've done. I've worked with similar populations my whole career, but I shifted from doing criminal defense work to doing case management, housing. I've also done some prisoners' rights work and some landlord-tenant law and a few other things along the way. So hopefully I can bring a lot of these different experiences to this training today. I myself do identify as a non-binary trans-masculine person. I was raised Jewish, and that's pretty much my identity for you there. I'm from Chicago. I went to Chicago public schools. I've gone to public universities for all of my education. And I actually currently live in the same neighborhood I grew up in, which is in the north side of Chicago in the West Ridge neighborhood. So with all that being said, I'm going to move right into the presentation for today. So first, we're going to start out talking about cultural humility, and then we're going to move into a Trans 101. And I like to pair these two trainings together because I think that they're completely related. I think it's really great to develop a lens around cultural humility when thinking about trans issues as well. And this can translate into all the areas of work that all of you are engaged in. Oh, I also want to say one other housekeeping thing, that we will take a break after the cultural humility portion and give folks probably about 10 minutes. So if you want to go grab some lunch and then come back to the computer, because we have a hard stop at 2:15, because there's another training after this. So just to find a little bit of housekeeping there. So let's move right into talking about why culture is so important. You know, culture is a vital factor in how we experience so many things, right? It's like how we experience our environment, our systems, ourselves. It incorporates all of these different needs, our motivations, our priorities, preferences, how we build family, how we create support networks, how we develop our goals, right? Like we all do service plans with clients, and we're constantly talking to clients about their goals, and it's also really speaks to how we're rooted in our own perceptions about ourselves and other people, right? So culture is really vital to so many things in our lives and how we move through the world. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between cultural humility and cultural competency. I feel like a lot of people are very aware of this concept of cultural competency. We hear it a lot. It's kind of a word. But I really want this portion of the training is really going to push us to think about culture, to think about cultural humility, and to think about a broader idea of what it means to work with people from different cultures, right? And this concept of cultural humility was actually developed by two women of color who are both in the medical profession. So and they both work as professors. And so they can do a much better job than I can as a white transmasculine person of explaining their own theory. And so I'm going to show a little video here. This is actually part of a 4-part movie that you can watch, a film that you can watch on YouTube. I only show, it's long. It's like I think it's about an hour. I only show about 2 minutes, a little over 2 minutes of it at the very beginning. But I do encourage folks to go back and watch this film on your own time, since it's accessible for free on YouTube. And the developers of cultural humility spend a lot of time talking about what it means to them, and they give a lot of really great examples. But we'll watch this clip here, and then we can circle back to the next slide.
Hey, Avi,
Yes.
we can't hear the video.
Oh my goodness, this whole time? Okay. Hi everyone. I've just been told that you cannot hear the video. So let me, I think that I know how to resolve this. Because this is something we should definitely resolve from the beginning because there's going to be multiple videos. So let's see here. I apologize if folks could just give me 1 second here to figure this out. Let's see here. Pause for the cause. Just take a second. Every setup is different, so I think I just assumed that you would be able to hear this. So it does say that it's sharing computer audio. Torlin, do you have any technical knowledge of sharing audio from my computer? Because it does say that it's the computer audio on the side here. Hold on. Sorry, y'all, 2 minutes to figure this out. It'll be beneficial for the rest of the presentation. I'm just gonna look into this really quickly.
Are you willing to go to the actual site of origin to get it?
I can go to the actual site of origin if you think that will work.
Let's try to explore that.
Okay, let's try that. It's funny because I embedded them in the video to make it easier in the PowerPoint. Could you hear that, Orlin?
No, I can't.
So like you can't hear that either?
No.
Okay, hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second here. Oh, sorry about this. Just looking to see if I can share. Yeah, so that's not making it any better. So hold on 1 second. Let me see if I can track something else here. I'm just looking up really quickly to see if I can find out how to do this really quickly.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for your patience.
So is there a question that we can pose to the audience so they can put some information in the chat or, as it relates to our topic today?
I mean, I think folks could, if they have any initial questions about the difference between cultural humility and cultural competency, but we haven't dug in very much yet. So, and there's going to be multiple videos. So,
did you turn up your volume on your computer?
Yeah, my volume is up on my computer. I can hear it. Could you hear that little ding there? Here, let's try this. Can you hear that? Could you hear that? Here, let me try this. Can you hear that?
Patient or clinician client or
Yes.
service provider
Okay.
community.
All right, so let's start over. Is it coming through loud enough?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, that was an easy fix, y'all. I apologize for that. It's because I was wearing headphones. So this is a whole new world that we're in right now. So we're learning new things every day. So let's go back into the presentation here. And of course, there we go. All right, take two. So let's start this video over so that you all can get the full benefit of it. Great. Thank you for your patience, everyone.
One word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually. If I had to encapsulate cultural humility or the whole concepts of cultural humility, it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
You.
Opening. Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal. Yes, our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
Cultural humility is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Tervalon and I conceptualized 3 dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often try to call me anything but African American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician, patient or clinician client, or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
So, so the way in which cultural humility differs from cultural competency is that in cultural competency, there's really this idea that you can achieve competence in somebody else's culture, right? Just in the term itself implies that. And in that video, they actually give an example of it happens later in the video, but they give an example with a African-American nurse and a Latinx patient, a Latinx woman, and the doctor comes in, and the woman is in a lot, she's experiencing a lot of pain, right? She's showing signs of experiencing pain. And the doctor says, we should really get her a prescription for pain medication. And the nurse says, oh, no, like I actually took a class on this, and Latino women just are like over dramatic in the way they express pain, right? So that's a stereotype that's being placed on somebody based on their culture. And it's very easy for somebody to say that they took a class in something, or that there's an endpoint to learning about someone's culture. And cultural humility really asks us to acknowledge that we can never be fully competent in knowing another person's culture, that becoming culturally competent cannot be reduced to like a checklist of characteristics that's associated with someone's culture. And I think that this actually is really important for those of us who are working with communities that we're from, because sometimes we will place our own experience onto that person. And cultural humility does not say that just because you are from the same, like, racial background or same even cultural background, that means that your experience is going to be the same, right? Of course, we all have experiences that we bring to this work, but sometimes I feel like when we're working with the communities we're from, we actually are prone to even make more assumptions sometimes, right? So we have to really deconstruct stereotypes, not just from communities that we're not a part of, but we also have to deconstruct stereotypes from communities that we are a part of as well. Because everybody's intersectional realities come to play in the way that they experience the world. So we have to acknowledge that we're lifelong learners and that we're never going to know everything. We have to deconstruct the stereotypes that exist both within and outside our communities. And then we really need to build respectful partnerships with the folks that we're working with. So, like that genuine curiosity, that exploring and honoring of differences. And we can do all of that. We can use all of those things to help clarify the client's goals, right? And to work towards that potential. And so we know that everything right now, especially right now, things are so much more chaotic for a lot of people than usual. And this is even more important, because if we try to place what our ideas are about somebody right now more than ever, we could actually be doing more harm than good. We want to really meet people where they're at this moment. And I don't think we can really talk about cultural humility without talking about equity. And they even bring up equity in that short clip that I shared with you all, which is this idea that there's not like a one size fits all approach to dismantling systems of oppression, right? Or to meeting our clients where they're at. This is a graphic that I imagine many of you may have seen before, but it's this idea that we can't give everyone the same size bicycle and think that they're going to be able to ride that bike. And that translates completely into the concepts of cultural humility, right? It's aligned with harm reduction. It's aligned with so many of these frameworks that so many of our organizations and so many of our colleagues are embracing, because it's really about tailoring our services to each individual, right? And meeting each person individually where they're at. And in doing that, we can create greater equity in the services that we provide. Hopefully, we can create greater equity in our own agencies. And I think it's really, really crucial that we listen to that piece about institutional accountability. I always give the same example when I talk about institutional accountability. And I'm going to say this without naming names, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are agencies right now that are ignoring the institutional accountability piece, and it's the most important. It's one of the most important pieces of this framework. When I was interning in my master's in social work program, I was required to take a online course on cultural humility through one of the agencies I was interning with. And at that time, I had already been facilitating trainings on cultural humility. And so I was really interested to see how, I'm always interested to see how other people are presenting on these same topics that I often present on. And I noticed they went through all of the tenets of cultural humility and they literally left out the institutional accountability tenet. And I thought it was really funny, not in a haha way, but I thought it was interesting that here was, one of the founders and creators of this whole framework saying this is the one piece that people leave out, and I was witnessing it happening right in front of me, that they just left out that piece of institutional accountability. So we all and if there's leaders, on this webinar, it's really important for us as leaders in agencies to really embrace that, that we have to hold ourselves accountable. And I think the world is crying that out right now, with all the protests we're seeing, is that it's time that we also have to recognize the part and the roles that we all play in reproducing these systems of oppression, even within our own communities. So are there any questions about any of that? I just wanted to give people an opportunity to jump in. Any questions yet, Torlin?
So let me take a look at it. And I think that I haven't seen any questions coming at this particular point in time.
Okay. I encourage everyone to chime in at any point. So the next part that I wanted to move into is really making this parallel between harm reduction and cultural humility. For those of you who are, managing, running, engaged in COC funded housing programs, we know that the Housing First model is designed within a harm reduction framework, and that these are requirements that our funders are asking us to adhere to. And there's a reason for that, because there's actually evidence to support the efficacy of these programs, right, or of this framework and how we work with our clients. And so some of the parallels between harm reduction and cultural humility really make sense. A lot of these frameworks are interconnected for a reason, right? Harm reduction, cultural humility, trauma-informed care. There's a reason why they all connect, because they're all rooted in the same type of, meeting our clients where they're at framework. And that's really working to hopefully, inevitably, really dismantle oppression. But we also have to realize that we are also part of the systems that our clients are impacted by. And that, all of that is really important in our critical self-reflection, is to not lose sight of how we are actually sometimes participating in these systems as well. So some of the ways that we can dismantle this on an individual level is through acknowledging that clients are experts in their own lives, right? That is a parallel. That's cultural humility says that, trauma-informed care says that, harm reduction says that. All those frameworks say that are aligned in that same way. Meeting the clients where they are, really working to reduce power dynamics and creating partnerships with our clients, collaboration. I always love the term creative collaboration, right? That clients have the right to define and prioritize their own goals. We might not always agree with what those goals are, but they have the right to define and prioritize them. We can learn skills on how to ask the right questions, and we can be resource advocates, but we're really trying to be less prescriptive and more collaborative with folks. That is totally in line with cultural humility, right? Like, we're taking time to really get to know who our clients are on an individual level and not attach some sort of preconceived notions about who they are. of course, we want to utilize all of the knowledge and the history we have of working with people from different communities to develop our own frameworks and our own approaches. But each person is coming to us with their own individual experience, right? And we have to sit with that, and we have to figure out how to walk that path with our clients. We really want to work towards empowering client self-determination and self-efficacy. Those are totally aligned, harm reduction and cultural humility, with harm reduction and cultural humility. And then even thinking about strengths-based approaches, right? It's this idea that we're constantly learning and growing. So we want to recognize and build upon our clients' strengths and resiliencies, and we want to figure out how we can be better partners with them, right? We want to honor clients' perceptions of illness and paths towards wellness. I work primarily with clients who are HIV positive. Not all of our clients are, but we have a large population of the folks we serve are HIV positive. And a lot of folks that we're working with are also experiencing dual diagnoses or, just extreme amounts of trauma. And sometimes we are literally, nothing that we are doing is working in terms of clients engaging in medical care, engaging in medication adherence. We might try all these different methods, and sometimes we have to figure out how to walk that path with clients. And sometimes, sadly, clients pass away because they were not able to adhere to practices that would promote their own physical wellness or emotional wellness, their mental health. And we have to figure out how to still be there with that person and support them through that, even when folks might die. And it's a hard place to be, and it's a hard place to figure out where our roles are in terms of our service provision, right? Because we don't want to push people away, and we want to figure out how to support people as much as possible. And one of the ways we do that is by developing a buffet of options, right? Maximizing the intervention options, giving people a lot of choices so that they can make informed decisions. That's a harm reduction framework, but that's also a cultural humility practice, right? The idea that we're creating these collaborations, that we're critically self-reflecting, so that we can come to these places where we can know what to even offer clients, right? We have to keep a very broad and open mind and constantly be absorbing new information as case managers, as administrators, as as care coordinators. The list is long of all the different types of work that we do. So, and then we're experimenting with all these different interventions and solution. And then this is so important. We have to respect different forms of wisdom and knowledge. I think that sometimes we have a very or a lot of people have a very specific idea of where wisdom comes from, of where knowledge comes from, of what it means to be an intellectual, right? You don't need to have as many degrees as I do, which I never will I go to school again. But you don't need to have as many degrees as you don't need to have a doctorate or a master's degree or a college education or a high school diploma, or you don't have to have graduated from 8th grade to have wisdom and knowledge, right? Harriet Tubman was an intellectual, people have deep knowledge and understanding of the systems that they're engaged in, and they also know what is best for them. And so we really have to continue to center our clients and to trust their wisdom and knowledge in this process. And I think Audre Lorde said it best, when there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. We cannot talk about cultural humility. We cannot talk about issues amongst trans and gender expansive communities without talking about intersectionality, without talking about all of the different ways that our clients, that our staff members, that we ourselves experience in terms of intersectional oppression. We don't our agencies don't exist in a vacuum. We're connected to the communities that we're a part of. For a lot of our agencies, we have staff members that are former clients. We have a lot of staff members that are from the communities we serve. We have administrators that are from the communities we serve. But we, again, have to keep that open mind that even when we are from those communities, that we also need to realize that our experiences might not be the same, right? Our trauma histories might not be the same. So, and the ways that we've been impacted by systems may not be the same. So I always ask this question in an open group. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it and see if anybody can throw in the chat window what this is representative of. And I think it's important for us in a framework of when talking about cultural humility, we have to understand the historical context of where our clients are at and why we see situations where people might be resistant to engaging in medical systems, why people might be resistant to engaging in all kinds of systems that have historically been oppressive to primarily folks of color, and most often and often in our history as a country with over 400 years of oppression of Black people. And so I'm wondering if anyone can chat in the window and say what this is an image of. So Torlin, whenever you, give folks a minute to chat in.
Sure.
And hopefully someone will. If you don't, it's okay, no pressure. But I'm gonna give it a minute.
Okay.
Anyone type in, Torlin?
No one typed in as of yet.
All right. Well,
so there is one comment that just came up.
Oh, okay.
It's coming in. So one of the comments was people from other skin colors have different chemistry, that their blood is different. Another person said segregation. Another person said Tuskegee.
Ding ding, ding ding.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes, it was the Tuskegee experiments.
Okay.
So I'm glad people chimed in. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, so what happened, for those who don't know, what happened during the Tuskegee experiments, and I think there's actually I've noticed when I do these trainings that there's also some misinformation out there about what actually happened during Tuskegee, but I think it's really telling that people think that that's what happened. So some people think that the government intentionally gave Black men syphilis. That's actually not what happened, but I do think that it's really telling that so many people think that. And a lot of the folks that I've heard that from are from Black communities, and that makes a lot of sense that people would think that. What happened is no less horrifying, but what actually happened is that they had people come in and do blood tests, and everyone does have the same blood, by the way. It doesn't matter what your skin color is, but well, we don't all have the same blood. We have a bunch of different types, but you know what I mean. But what they did is they knew syphilis was spreading, and so what they did is they tested. They offered these free blood tests and quote free treatment, but it was all a fallacy. It was fake, and they didn't tell people, specifically Black men. They did not tell them that they had syphilis, and then they literally studied them as they got sick and died, and then studied their bodies afterwards. And this went through into, I believe, the late 60s or early 70s was the completion and of the study, and it's horrifying. And they had penicillin. They could have treated these men, and they chose not to for a study. So they unwittingly, like, people did not know that they were basically being, there was a human study happening on them, and that they were intentionally being allowed to die. That is not that long ago that this happened. So there's a lot of reasons why people do not trust medical systems in this country, because they are also rooted in white supremacist practices. And so we have a history of eugenics in this country, and eugenics is where they had basically, I don't know if anyone has ever seen these, but they're like, you know, pictures of the human brain, or like trying to make distinctions between the brain of like a Black person and a white person, or like a Jewish person, and, you know, and saying, basically trying to say all of these things about somebody's like intelligence, their physical characteristics, all kinds of things, just based on their race or ethnicity. And the interesting thing about our history of eugenics in this country is that the Nazis actually modeled their eugenics program. So for those of you who have ever heard of Dr. Mengele, he did all of these horrifying experiments on Jews during the Holocaust, and a lot of experiments on twins. And it's just very, very horrifying things that he did. But they based their eugenics program on our eugenics program in the United States. They thought, oh wow, they're really onto something, and then they took it to another extreme. But it's really important to acknowledge our own history around medical systems in this country, and why, and some of the reasons why, through generational trauma, through you know, like perceptions that are passed over time, why some people might not engage in our medical systems, and might not even understand why fully. So, and I bring all this up because it's an example of how we need to meet our clients where they're at, and how we need to understand culture, and how culture impacts the way that we move through the world. So moving into the piece on self-reflection, and just to follow up, does anyone have any questions about that? I know that was a lot of information.
No, I don't see any additional questions, Avi.
Okay, great. Thanks, Torlin. I feel like we have like a walkie-talkie, Torlin, even though we don't, but thank you for your support through this. So moving into the piece about self-reflection, one of the things I always talk about when I'm facilitating trainings and conversations like this is that we really need to look inward. I think a lot of times we get really burned out in the work that we do. And once we get really burned out, we start making assumptions about folks, and it's really easy for us to kind of fall into a pattern of not taking that step back and looking at how we are impacting interactions. And so when I'm doing like de-escalation trainings, or when I'm talking to staff and new staff orientations and things like that, I always pose this and say, if you get into an argument, like if a client is upset with you, or if there's a situation that escalates, or if something doesn't quite work out the way that you thought it would, for me personally, I always look first at myself, not in like a judgmental way, but in a self-reflective check-in way to see, is there anything I could have done differently in this situation? Is there something that I could look at, that we could tweak, and we have to look at the root of judgments that we make about individuals. We have to constantly check in with ourselves. We can't get complacent with that, because even for those of us who have maybe been always engaged in self-reflection, it's so easy when you're feeling tired, and like right now, I know a lot of folks are feeling really tired. A lot of folks are not just working with their clients. A lot of people have been trying to support their clients while their communities have been impacted around them through a lot of destruction, through the protests and uprisings. Folks have been impacted by COVID. Where a lot of us had to adjust to a new way of working from home. You know, there's just so many things happening around us right now that we're impacted by, that like now is really a time where we need to try to stay more present in the work we're doing, because it's really easy to get tired, because people are doing all the hard work at home, and then maybe you're in the streets later protesting, or you're, I mean, who knows what's going on for everybody. There's 81 of you on this call right now, so I'm sure that it's a very broad experience, but we have to keep looking inward and thinking about how we can adjust and how we can seek out resources to further examine and correct the judgments that we have. And we can do that in partnership with our communities at work and with our communities around us at home, and in our different areas of life. So, sorry, my slide show here is not wanting to go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, let me make sure that is the next one. It is. So I wanted to follow up with that conversation. It's really important for us when we're talking about cultural humility and this idea that we're lifelong learners to, I approach cultural humility in the similar way that I approach an anti-oppression framework, right? That we have to identify, I feel like you're probably feeling like I'm a broken record, but we have to identify the way that these are playing out in our own environments, the way that all these little things not only impact our relationships with our clients, but they impact our relationships with coworkers and a larger liberation struggle. And so I'm going to play 2 videos about microaggressions. I have seen microaggressions play out in my own agency. I've seen them play out in many areas of my life. I know that I have been a perpetrator of microaggressions before, and I've had to learn over time, and it's a constant learning process as a white person to dismantle my own racism and to be an anti-racist person in this world. And so I'm going to show this first short video on racial microaggressions. It's from 2014, so you'll notice that the way they're talking, that Obama was still in office. And it's about a performance piece that students of color at Harvard put together about microaggressions. The second video that I'm going to show on microaggressions is going to be, it's in one of those MTV shorts that's kind of funny, and it shows what it would be like if white people experienced microaggressions in the same way as folks of color. I would also say that, and it's one thing that they don't point out here in either one of these videos, that fat people experience a high level of microaggressions. And a lot of our clients who have multiple identities, they might, have multiple racial, cultural identities, and might also be fat people. And I say that I'm a fat positive human, so it's not a bad word for me to say fat. But I do want to point that out, that is not something that's included here. But I have worked with a lot of clients who experience a lot of body shame. And I think that we don't also realize the ways that we reproduce, how we microaggress against people who are perceived as fat in our country. So I'm going to go ahead and play this first video here.
We face a different generation of racism than our parents did. Things were much more blatant. So it's easy to say that's racist, you're racist, this is a racist institution. But we're facing things that you're like, okay, am I crazy, or did they just do this? And so it kind of, we internalize a lot.
Does anyone have the dedication?
This is Tanzina Vega reporting for the New York Times. At the Lowell Lecture Hall in Cambridge, crowds gathered to see I Too Am Harvard, a one-night performance put on by students who feel marginalized at the university.
Does anyone actually have physical tickets in their hands?
Like, people think we're just gung-ho. Like, no, there was times we didn't want to do this because it made us really like uncomfortable and have to face things and have to face people that we were not like prepared to.
The play was based on a student interview project and Tumblr page, also called I Too Am Harvard. The project focuses on tiny offhand comments, the kind that can seem innocent but can really sting under the surface.
At the beginning of the year, introducing myself to people, sometimes people would take a step back and be like, wait, what are you?
They're called microaggressions, and younger generations are increasingly responding to them.
The microaggressions that I encounter are simply people who don't realize my racial background and who really question it. So, are you really Asian? Can I see a photo of your mother?
Microaggression is an academic term that's been around for decades, but recently it's taken root in social media campaigns as students across the country are questioning whether their generation is indeed colorblind.
It's important to have the vocabulary to be able to like describe your lived experiences in order to feel like they're justified, because people are always trying to dismiss them. We have to show that like these little daily microaggressions are just like sort of the little bubbling up of greater racial tensions that are like underlying this whole post-racial, like if we have this post-racial surface, there's like all of these extreme racial tensions underneath the surface where people are like, oh, we have a black president, we're post-racial, but still like it's okay to shoot a child just for having like black skin.
You don't know how to respond. You don't want to make it a big deal, but it is. And you almost regret some of those moments.
There might be a comment that I don't want to think too much into because I'll rather just ignore it and then move on. So, but that's why I really enjoy the play, to see those that aren't necessarily ignoring it, but trying to do something about it.
Why do you ignore it? Why do you ignore it?
It's always easier to ignore.
To be clear, there's a risk in calling out microaggressions. Some worry it can make a situation more uncomfortable. And critics say these student campaigns are an overreaction to unintended offenses. But for some, conversations like these are a good reminder to be more aware.
As a social worker who's gone through many lessons of racism and sexism, where people think they're experts but they're not, and don't recognize that it's a lifetime of learning and a lifetime of interactions where you continue to learn and grow. I felt like it was an enormous opportunity to be reminded once again of what's real.
We face a different generation.
So I'm gonna just go ahead and show the next video right away, and then I can see if there's any questions after this one.
You're not good at golf, but you're white. People of color have to deal with racial microaggressions every single day. So microaggressions are those little unintentional insults that basically see people of color as stereotypes, which got me thinking, what if white people had to deal with racial microaggressions?
So like, where are you from? No, like, where are you really from?
Why do you have an accent? Like a Swedish accent?
You know, your English is really, really good. It's like, I can't even tell you have an accent, right?
I don't have an accent.
No, that's what I'm saying. You don't speak Gaelic?
You don't speak German?
Can you say a curse word European?
You know, like, what does that even mean?
Hey Connor, you know about NASCAR stuff, right? Can you take a look at this?
Can you teach me how to line dance?
Play the banjo?
Act entitled in the supermarket. Love white food. No real flavor to it. Never an upset tummy.
You're so exotic.
How do you get your hair like that? I love how it's so limp. Ew, why does it feel like that? Oh my God, so it just does that? No, you are really pretty for a white girl.
Your eyes are so round, like this.
You know what you look like? Kenny Chesney, Zach Braff,
Emma Stone,
Rachel Maddow, my friend Chad. Maybe you know him. He's white too.
No, Emma Watson.
Not Macklemore. What's the other guy?
Is it Emma Thompson?
It's CHAD, like Chad.
One of the Emmas. You look like an Emma.
You know who you look like? I bet you hear this all the time. Jeffrey Dahmer. How does it feel to be the token white guy in the office? Hey, Connor, can we get a white perspective on this? I love everything about white culture. You guys are like so fun. What do you mean you don't listen to Creed? You're white.
You've never tried. you're white.
You don't act like a normal white person.
You're not really white though.
You're not really white. I'm whiter than you are.
So, did all your ancestors own slaves?
No, but of course he wishes that he could still own slaves. That's a part of his culture. Right, back me up on this one. But then you have to understand about white culture.
I went to a historically white college, so I know about white culture.
in Europe. So can you see how ridiculous this was? I know. Story of my life. If you've ever experienced microaggressions because of your race, gender, sexuality, or body type, go ahead and vent about it in the comments.
Can you teach me how to like take a really popular rap song and like make it a ukulele song? It's so cool. I think it's so cool how you guys do that.
Does anyone have any initial thoughts or comments about that? I don't want people to have to disclose microaggressions that they've experienced, but if you would like to, we can definitely read those out, or if you have any questions or comments, I'll just give folks like a minute to type anything in there if you would like. I can give you an example of a microaggression that I experienced, but like it was obviously it was more of a body type microaggression and not one that was rooted in my racial identity. But I was at work one day and we had candy dishes around the office, and I went to go get candy out of the candy dish. And there was somebody in leadership at my agency who literally said, Avi, go put that back, right? Because I'm a fat person, right? So like I wasn't supposed to eat candy. And it was just like it was very shocking to me. But that kind of stuff happens all the time, those like little things where people feel like that they can say something to you like that. And we see that play out all the time in our agencies, and that was a very minor example. I've seen microaggressions play out many times in the workplaces. I see a lot of white people feeling that they can touch Black people's hair. I think that's something that comes up a lot. I've seen that happen. I've seen people literally change the way they talk. Like white people will change the way they talk when they're talking to folks of color in ways that are, very offensive, but thinking that, that they have that's their right to do that. There are a lot of the other ones that came up that I think are more familiar to folks, but I'm wondering.
Avi, I have a couple to share with you.
Oh, great. That's beautiful. Thank you, Torlin.
So one of the comments is that everyone said how realistic they felt it was, which I thought that just kind of hit home. But one person commented, says, I thought it was interesting the sign read, can you teach me how to twerk? Something that they felt like was very interesting, something that they heard. And then I want to share some additional information that others shared. Someone said, I've experienced microaggression. I was told that I am well educated. I think that many times without even noticing, is what someone shared, is that I think many times without even noticing it, we participate in those microaggressions, and it's important to catch ourselves and realize when we are behaving in that manner. And then someone said, just like you said at the very beginning, right at the end, it says, happens a lot, especially with my hair as a Black woman, because it's mostly amongst my same culture, actually. So it's something there. And then, yes, a white person touched my hair after I said no. But that people of my own culture have told me that I was born in Puerto Rico, even though I was born in Chicago and I have an accent. And then someone shared, I'm a DV survivor. I've heard, how did that happen to a nice girl like you? You don't look like a DV survivor. Yeah. So that was your statements. And then someone shared, I'm multiracial, and people have told me multiple times that they're surprised by how well spoken I am.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being vulnerable and sharing those. Yeah, I mean, I think you all, you definitely have everyone who shared, and I'm sure many more people who did not share have experienced these microaggressions, and it can really chip away, right? It's like what they were talking about, like the one guy from the first video who's like, it's always easier to ignore, but only for so long, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone for sharing. I mean, there's very powerful statements and sharing these experiences. That's really awesome.
Yeah, it was really, thank you so much, everyone. I know it's very strange that we're not all in the same room together to be able to talk about this. And I think this is a good way to segue into unpacking language, because it's really just so connected with what we were just talking about with microaggressions. And I really like this quote, that to be mindful that speaking and listening are themselves political acts, and that try as I might, my own contribution may replicate patterns of oppression and operate to wound others. So really thinking about how we say things, right? So many people are saying these things that are hurting others, and it's unintentional, but intention is not really the focus, right? It's always the impact, and we always have to be thinking more about what our impact is and less about what our intention is when we're hurting people. So we really have to listen, right? Like, and I think that again, like cultural humility is asking us to listen, right? That framework is asking us to listen. It's asking us, we have to think about how these words that we use reinforce attitudes that are often contain unstated beliefs and cultural biases. A lot of you brought up examples of that. I think somebody brought up the example of being well spoken, and somebody else brought up the example of being well educated. And I think that, sometimes we might find ourselves saying that, that person is really smart, right? But thinking about what is that rooted in? Like, why do we feel the need to have to state that? I mean, obviously, when we're working with our clients, sometimes we do need to evaluate like people's capacity for, in terms of cognition, to be able to tailor services that will work for that person, but not rooting that in some sort of surprise that because somebody maybe doesn't have the same education level that we do, that they're somehow not smart, or being surprised that somebody does have the same education level that somebody else might have. So, and we have to really pay attention, because it can be really hard for people to hear or notice when they're doing this. And we have to work to not create terminology that's gonna further divide us. And so I wanted to use one example, and that I hear used all the time among service providers and among clients. And this is this concept of clean or dirty, right? And this is often used in substance use context, but it's also often used around HIV testing, like that somebody's blood was clean or somebody's blood was dirty. And what are these hidden attitudes? What are we communicating to somebody when we say things like this? How do these words work to empower versus alienate the people that we serve? And so when we tell somebody, oh, did you drop clean today, when we're talking about like a substance, like a urine test or a blood test for substances, we're automatically placing a very serious judgment about somebody's body on whether they tested positive or negative for substances. We are increasing that cycle of shame with clients for their use when we are referring to that as clean or dirty. Now, I would never recommend that somebody tell a client, oh, don't use that term, because I don't see that as my role. But what I do think we can do is we can model something different. So if I'm working with a client who says, yeah, I dropped dirty today, I might respond by saying, how does it make you feel that you tested positive? I know you've been working really hard towards your substance use goal of abstinence. And that can, just setting that model, like I'm not going to reproduce those feelings of internal judgment. that that person is having about their own use, because I guarantee they're getting enough shame from the world around them and from themselves that, like, I don't need to reproduce that. I don't need to accentuate that in any way. So really asking us to think about these terms that we have just been using forever and how that might be impacting people, how that might be perpetuating a cycle that we're not even realizing we're perpetuating just by simple words that we're using. And, you know, thinking about what are some ways that we can communicate using compassionate person-centered language versus some of the language that has just become the norm around us. So here are some examples that I have of some person-centered language that's really strengths-based versus deficits-based. So one, for example, that we hear all the time is addict, right? That has such a negative connotation. People throw it around. The person becomes their substance use versus being somebody with a substance use disorder or somebody who uses substances, right? Because not everybody who uses substances would be classified as having a disorder either. So really trying to move away from some of this pathologizing language and really trying to be more compassionate and strengths-based with folks. We hear this term a lot, right? Frequent flyer, and people think it's, you know, funny. We hear this a lot in the criminal legal context with people who are incarcerated, for folks who come back for services over and over again. We could use the term utilizes services and supports when necessary. Somebody's being hostile and aggressive versus being protective. Somebody's being resistant, right? We can think about somebody's choosing not to, isn't ready for, isn't open to yet, right? Placing our own perceptions of what somebody's experiencing using terms like suffering with, right? We don't know that somebody's suffering with something. That's not our determination. Somebody might be working to recover from something or experiencing or living with. The manipulative has become a very, very, and I find I have to admit, I fall into this one. It's a very powerful statement. It's a very negative connotation. It doesn't mean that people don't manipulate situations, but when you call somebody manipulative, it's very negative, when for a lot of our clients, they're actually just like really good at getting their needs met and are very resourceful. You know, somebody's being lazy. We hear this a lot, but maybe it's that they're having ambivalence. They're working, a lot of clients have a really, really hard time finding their own motivation in a world that has been fairly oppressive to them, or their trauma histories impact their ability to move forward. There's so many reasons why somebody might not be able to meet even the own goals that they state. You know, really centering a person, like a person with a mental illness versus somebody who's mentally ill. We could go through all this for a while. I'm wondering if there's any, though, on this list that aren't on this list that people have heard and that they wanted to share with the group, and that you've maybe come up with a way to say something differently, or you've heard something said differently than on this list. So I'll just give folks you know, a minute to chat in on that.
I don't see anything yet, Avi.
Okay.
So give everybody maybe a couple of seconds, maybe. Please.
Yeah, there's another slide that's related, so I'll move to the next slide, and if folks come up with anything, just throw it in the chat.
So one of the questions says, okay, one person asked you to repeat the question, but then someone says, I've heard people refer to a lesbian as queer. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's interesting. So yeah. I think it depends on the context. So for example, I identify as queer. That's a positive thing for me as a queer identified person. And queer is really an academic term that came about in the 90s. And it was this idea of trying to make a broader definition for people who might identify within LGBTQ communities. Because a lot of people, like, the idea of being a lesbian is a very binary identity. So it means that you identify as a woman and that you only are with people who also identify as a woman, right? So a lot of people who might have identified as lesbians at some point might no longer feel a kinship with that identity, because maybe they are dating somebody who is non-binary, or maybe they are dating a trans person or something like that, and then that might change the way that you identify in the world. And so queer is really this identity that has become, it's broader, but it's not used in every single cultural group, right? Like, not every community feels comfortable with using that word, even though it's used, I mean, it's used pretty broadly at this point, but not everybody feels totally comfortable with it. So I think and then also it's rooted in an oppressive statement, right? Because people used to call people queer in a very derogatory way. And so I think it depends on the context and like who's using it.
So one person wrote risky behavior versus people vulnerable to.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Thank you for sharing that. I think we do use.
And then real quickly, someone wrote, I'm a gay woman and do not use queer to identify.
Right.
And someone commented that really isn't my experience as a non-binary lesbian. Non-binary identities are very common within the lesbian community, but yes, always get consent before referring to people as queer. And then someone shared relapse, substance reoccurrence.
Oh yeah, that's good. I like that. I actually hadn't heard that one, substance reoccurrence. I'm gonna write that down. See, I love this. And I wanted to thank you for the folks who chimed in about like using queer. I think that that's true for any identity, right? Like we have the it should be our the power should be within our hands to determine what our identities are, and other people shouldn't place identities on us. So it's always best to ask somebody how they want to be identified, right? And to not make assumptions about people. In terms of the risky, I think that was a really great one to bring up as well, because all of these things that we're talking about evolve so quickly. When I started doing these trainings, like even 5 years ago, what was considered the language that was most acceptable has actually even shifted since then, right? Like now people are talking about not even using the term vulnerable as much and using the term targeted, right? I was right in that, like, communities aren't vulnerable, they're like targeted by these systems of oppression, right? And so this is evolving so quickly, which is why cultural humility is so important, because it's asking us to constantly be on this journey, right? This journey of learning and growing.
Right. So I have two more for you, just to kind of put a little non-compliant with meds versus choosing not to take meds.
Yeah, compliant. Oh, I could not tell you enough about the word compliant. I'll get on that in a minute once Torlin's done.
Yeah, and then individuals experiencing homelessness as to oppose to a homeless person.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, those are great. And I think that, we should always be talking about somebody who's experiencing something instead of making their whole identity focused around their experience, right? Like calling someone a homeless person versus saying somebody who is experiencing homelessness. There's a big difference in the way that feels and the message that it sends. The term compliant is a word that is used extensively in the field of social work, and even more extensively in the field of medicine. And I've had clients have incredibly negative reactions to that term. It's also very paternalistic. It makes people feel like they're being told that they have to do something and they're not complying with it. It's rooted in, a lot of people have histories of being in institutional settings where that term has been thrown at them a lot. So it can be very triggering, and it's also it's not giving people, it's not supporting people's own agency and own self-determination. And so we try really hard to use terms like medication adherence, or somebody is you know, has barriers to engaging in medical systems, or has barriers with going to the doctor, really focusing on barriers versus whether someone's, quote, being compliant or not. So I wanted to touch a little bit on trans issues. We're going to get a lot more into trans issues in the second half of today. But when our forms, even, I point this out because I want to point out that even when we are trying to meet people where they're at and meet communities that we're serving where they're at, that we still have work to do. So for an example, when our forms ask women to identify as either, quote, female or trans female, what message are we sending? How does that message work to affirm or deny womanhood? What we're saying in that moment is we're saying that you have to make a distinction between what type of woman you are. And I think it gets complicated, but it's important to know that even when we're trying to be affirming, that could still be causing harm. And that for some people, having to identify over and over again that they're trans is really unaffirming and can actually causes some harm for folks, because a lot of people are like, I just want people to see me as a woman, right? I don't want to have to say I'm a trans woman. And that's different for everybody. Like, I will scream from the rooftops that I'm a non-binary trans masculine person, but that is not how it feels for everybody. For some people, the dysphoria that they experience around their identity impacts them so intensely that these things can actually be harmful. And we'll unpack that more in the next one, so don't worry if that is a little confusing. We're going to unpack this a lot more later. Another one that I hear a lot in HIV communities is making the person synonymous with being HIV positive, right? So they're HIV, they're infected, they're suffering with. And we see this with a lot of, we see this a lot in HIV communities, and I think that it exists in other settings as well, but there's such a long history of stigma around HIV that I wanted to point this out specifically, that people are living with HIV, right? And they're not necessarily suffering at all. Like, people can live long, full, healthy lives and be HIV positive. So here are some other examples that I wanted to point out around this language, which is, you know, a lot of people use these terms like AIDS carrier, AIDS infected, HIV infected, quote, transmitters. These are terms that are really reproducing stigma and perpetuating stigma against people who are HIV positive. So really referring to people as somebody who's living with HIV, right? Trying to move away from drug addicts and drug abusers. Again, it's an incredibly stigmatizing term, both of those terms, and really moving to people who use substances. People are complex humans. They aren't boiled down to one aspect of their identity, right? Or one aspect of their behavior, I should say. Just because somebody uses drugs doesn't then mean that their entire identity is a drug addict. Just because somebody uses injection drugs doesn't mean that their whole identity boils down to being an ID, like an intravenous drug user or an injection, you know. And not everybody who injects drugs injects them intravenously either. A lot of people inject them subcutaneously. There's a lot of different ways that people inject drugs. Again, the term prostitute or prostitution, at this point, to me, that's a legal term. I only use that term if I'm reading a statute. People who engage in trading sexual acts for money are actually doing work. That's sex work. And they using that term prostitution, again, is very rooted in boiling somebody's identity down to a behavior that they engage in. And it's also incredibly stigmatizing, right? And a lot of people engage in sex work for survival, but a lot of people engage in sex work very consensually as well and voluntarily. So, and some people are forced into sex work. There's a huge continuum when it comes to sex work. And so it's really important to try to remove those stigmatizing terms and judgments and listening to communities of sex workers to hear how they want to be referred to. And then using the term safe sex or unprotected sex, again, is really rooted in this idea that you can have safe sex, which is complicated. That's not really the case. There's no such thing as, quote, safe sex or unprotected sex, but we can encourage folks to have safer sex, and we can promote that within our agencies and within the communities that we serve. So we're almost to the end of this portion here, and I just wanted to revisit these last few. I want to revisit the original tenets of cultural humility, and then we can move into. And we're actually doing really, really good on time, y'all. So we may actually finish early, just because I typically do these in person, and there's a lot of conversation that happens that extends it. So, but we'll take a break and then we'll come back for the Trans 101 after this one piece here. But I just want to revisit that communities, that we want to center communities as experts in their experiences and needs, and that we want to recognize and challenge power imbalances. So many of the things that we talked about and that I talked about in this last hour are about us challenging power imbalances, about us recognizing that everybody that we work with, that inherently we have a power imbalance when it comes to working with them, because we are, even if we don't have all of the things that they need, we are perceived as gatekeepers of resources, right? Like, to our clients, we might be the only connection that they have to get resources that they need. There's an inherent power imbalance that exists there. And so we have to constantly be aware of that, and how we are working towards collaborating with our clients versus perpetuating hierarchy. And we also, as everybody knows, we have to do that while maintaining our boundaries too, right? I shouldn't assume that everybody knows that, but we have to do all of that, challenging power imbalances, figuring out how to, collaborate with people while maintaining boundaries. None of these things are easy to do, which is why we need to constantly be having ongoing conversations. And we need to be having these ongoing conversations on leadership levels too, not just on the levels where we're doing direct service, because we, as leaders in agencies, as administrators in agencies, if there's any folks on this webinar who fit into that description, we have to hold our own institutions accountable. That's our responsibility. That's part of the part that we can play also in this movement that's happening right now, is that we are part of larger nonprofit systems that have often perpetuated the very oppression that we may be fighting against, right? We run programs oftentimes that actually keep people poor, because we're running programs that say, if you make this much money, sometimes our programs say, if you make this much money, you can't be in this program anymore. But that cutoff point of how much money somebody gets, right, is not enough for somebody to necessarily sustain themselves on their own. Plus, there's no safety net for people. Like, we're not helping people create safety nets if people don't have, communities that can support them. And so we also have to recognize that sometimes we're not actually saving. I like to say I'm not saving the world, but that everything I'm doing is a form of harm reduction in a system that's riddled with inequities and oppressions, right? And so that's the way I approach this work. And that's the way I try to hold the institutions that I'm a part of accountable, by raising my voice and really trying to encourage others to also critically self-reflect in the decisions they're making. And this can go all the way to the board levels, right? We have a lot of boards and a lot of our agencies that maybe aren't getting the same education that we're getting about anti-oppression frameworks and about cultural humility. And oftentimes they're making a lot of decisions for our agencies. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and it's all can be rooted in these frameworks of cultural humility, harm reduction, trauma-informed care. These are all anti-oppression frameworks. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions or comments before we take a break? Was there anything that seemed unclear? And again, just because we're moving into Trans 101, it's totally going to follow along all this stuff. So if stuff comes up from the first part and you're realizing it in the second part, you can always chime in then too. Just always feel free to ask questions or to make comments. So Torlin, I'll hand it over to you for a second to let me know if there's anything that that's coming up for folks.
So one of the comments, and thanks, Avi, I appreciate that. And everyone, I just wanted to say thanks for all your comments and support to the topic. You're awesome as we make our transition. But one of the comments was most times board members and upper management at agencies are given a pass to learn all of this valuable stuff. And that
I could not agree more. Sorry,
yeah.
Go on.
And then the another comment says about intersectionality. Can you talk about multiple identities and power dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk about that a lot in the next session as well. But when I talk about intersectionality, what I'm talking about is the idea that individuals experience multiple oppressions at one time. And have multiple experiences at one time. And so I'll use myself as an example, and then I'll use a comparative example. So like I've said a million times, I'm a white, transmasculine, non-binary, Jewish, radical. I could keep going. I'm an abolitionist. I'm a lot of things. But I've experienced depression, and I'm a fat person. So I've experienced depression in a lot of intersecting ways, right? I still have a lot of privilege, right? I grew up on the North Side. I grew up in a middle-class family. My mother is a retired social worker. My father is a retired CPS teacher. We were not wealthy, but I certainly grew up with in a stable economic environment, right? But then I might be working with a trans woman of color who lives on the South Side, who was, kicked out of her home, has experienced abuse and violence both at the hands of her family, her community, and law enforcement, right? There's access barriers to employment due to potentially a felony conviction due to a survival crime, that she then cannot get her name changed, so she can't even get a job utilizing the name that matches her gender identity. The list goes on and on, right? And so that is like an example of like how intersectionality plays into our experiences and also like creates barriers to people, which is why the conversation around equity is so important, because we can't just make these blanket determinations for people when everybody's experiences are so different. And that we could have, honestly, we could spend like a whole semester talking about that and unpacking that. But I hope that spoke to what the commenter was talking about.
Yeah, and then there's this comment that came in that said, a lot of times persons who create rules for programs are so far removed from direct client service that they lose the reality of what things are actually like on the ground. Lots of stuff looks good on paper, but don't work on it in actually reality, such as income limits to programs that are unrealistic. It just pushes people to lie. Is what the person wrote. Mm-hmm. And then someone else shared that proximity to a community it does not mean you're not racist, cultural humble. And not give you the absolution just because you serve a particular community. It's not enough to be nice. It's not enough to smile. White people, especially white people in power, have to do better. Have to do better by their employees and clients, not just work next to them. They have to be active, strategic, acknowledge their limited perspectives on race, and look to people in their agencies who can really make a difference where they cannot.
Yeah, I want to speak to this because multiple people have brought it up and I could not agree more. I think that we, like kind of what I was saying earlier about reproducing the same systems of oppression that we are aiming to fight against within our own agencies. And I think that's pretty evident even in our own like salary, the way that we, the disparities in salaries between people at the highest level versus people on the ground doing the work every day. I do think we need to have more collaboration with staff around program design. I think we also face a lot of challenges with our funders because our funders are typically super far removed, right? And our funders are telling us what type of work we can even do. So, you know, for example, you know, HUD will say that everyone in our programs needs to have, you know, needs to increase income by a certain percentage, right? And we get dinged on that when we can't show that there was an increase in income. Well, we all know that it's so hard, right, to help people increase their income in the systems that we're in, and with all of the trauma and barriers that people face to engage in a system that's also rooted in white supremacy, right? So we're asking people that are most impacted by white supremacy with all of their trauma and everything they've gone through to then fit themselves into this mold that has been created by white supremacy as well. And so we have a lot of work to do within our own agencies, leaders, board members. We need to have different people on the boards at agencies, right? So that people are making, so the people who are making decisions about the direction of our agencies are actually from the communities that are being served. But it's so hard, I think, to make a lot of these changes when nonprofits are essentially private organizations that are trying to fundraise all the time, and who has the money to put the funds in. And so there's just like so many layers that we have to peel back. But I think the first step to that is having open eyes and acknowledging that there's a problem, right? We talk about the stages of change all the time in social work and services. Right. We have to recognize that within our own agencies, right? Like we have to work towards that change within our own agencies, and we can't just say that we stand for, and I think this is even more present right now, given the movement that is happening in this country in ways that we have not seen, that it is time for our own agencies to really look inward and to critically self-reflect and think about how we can shift power dynamics within this system that is set up to have power dynamics, right? Like we have to think outside the box big time, and we have a time right now where we can dream big and think big about what's possible. And we really have to challenge ourselves and the communities that we're a part of to move forward and to hold people accountable. But that's hard to do because everybody has different privilege too. I understand, like people are worried about their jobs too, you know, like how much can you push and how much can you, how much can you work towards creating these conversations right now where people are listening more than usual?
Right. So I have a comment that I want to share with you as well. So, and I think it kind of, it addresses some of the things you just shared. When you say it's, this person shared, saw multiple agencies post a black square on social media without sharing resources or addressing how they will work harder themselves as an organization, especially agencies whose leadership makeup is mostly white with black and queer employees working in the lowest paid client-centered positions.
Yes, this is a huge issue, right? I think we're seeing it everywhere. Like it's easy to say Black Lives Matter, but if you don't actually know what that means,
Right.
that you're not gonna be able to make change. And agencies do need to have a plan of action and not just say words or just post a black square like folks are saying. I think there needs to be, like, you cannot have a single training and think that you have overcome racism and white supremacy within your agency, right? These are long-term processes that people need to commit to, that people need to engage in, and people need to look inward when they're wondering why their agency's leadership is mostly white, and why their boards are mostly white, and why they can't recruit people of color to join their boards even. And that is something that people really need to look inward on, because there's a very definite reasons for that. And until folks are really self-reflecting and not thinking about this, and it's not just about self-reflecting, because if you don't have the frameworks, then your self-reflection could actually make things worse. So people need to also work to educate themselves, and go to and engage in like years-long processes that don't end, right? These aren't things that end. Like, we've had oppression of Black people in this country for over 400 years. We're not ending that in 15 days, right? So it's a real commitment, and it's a commitment to changing structures. And I think that that's really scary for a lot of people. I'm being very real with y'all on here right now. So does anyone else have any comments before we can keep this conversation going into the next section too, but I just want to see if there's any other comments or anything that you want to comment
There's
on.
not anything else at the moment.
Okay. So it is now like 11:38. So what I'm thinking is if folks could come back at 11:50, like if you need to like go why don't we do 15 minutes, just like in case you need to like go to your kitchen. I know most of us are or maybe a lot of us are still working from home. I certainly am. But let's do 11:55. We can come back and then we'll jump into the next section, and folks can just like kind of eat while at the computer, because just so we can make sure we have enough time to get through everything. Does that work for folks? For Torlin? Yay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'll see y'all at 11:55.
Okay.
I'll just leave this up and running if that's okay.
That is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So Avi, you can put yourself on mute if you like. Bobby, I'm back.
Me too. All right. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We are gonna just dive right in here to the Trans 101 portion of this. I say Gender and Identity 101 because we're gonna be talking about more than just trans identities. We're also gonna touch on intersex identities and also that these identities around gender and identity are constantly evolving. And one thing you'll hear me say so many times during this presentation is I also didn't out my age, but I'm 43 years old. And even though I feel like a young person still in my heart, I am recognizing more and more that I can no longer identify that way. I am recognizing that I'm a little bit more out of touch than I would like to even admit to myself. But that I learn so much from young people. I have learned about how I can even identify my own gender in ways that were not possible for me when I was graduating high school in 1995 in Chicago, when there were no gay straight alliances at any schools anywhere. I was like right on that cusp of when we started seeing school groups forming and things like that. And so I just want to say that so much of what I'm talking about right now and things that and the newer things that I'm learning are coming through my interactions with young people who are just really kind of letting me know, and I think letting a lot of people know about what's possible, which is a beautiful thing. And I think we can say the same about a lot of the movements we're seeing happening right now, that so many of them are driven and led by young people and historically have been led by young people. So this is an artist, Micah Bezant, who does a lot of really great activist art. So if you ever wanted to check out Micah's artwork, this is just a piece that I've always really loved, and I've had it on this training for years, and I think it's actually really, given the present moment, it's even more appropriate. So I'm going to start first by, again, just stating the kind of ground rules that I said earlier, just around like I am open to all questions as long as they're asked respectfully, and that I will try to point out that if I'm sharing something personally about myself to make a point, that that's something that I'm doing very consensually, but that doesn't mean that it's appropriate to ask somebody a question like, you know, to get the same kind of answer that I'm giving you. And I'll point those out as we're going through. So first, I just like to start with just a basic definition, right? Like if we're going to get at the etymology, like the root of the word transgender, that trans is really defined as moving above, beyond, across, or through, right? We see trans used, you know, transportation, right? It's the root of that word. And then gender is very specifically the social cultural roles assigned at birth based on anatomical sex assigned at birth. Now, I very clearly state that these are assigned at birth, that both the cultural role, the social cultural role, and the anatomical sex, because the reality is that we have socially constructed the idea of sex. And I think that's a hard concept sometimes for people to wrap their heads around, but we're going to talk about intersex identity in a little bit. And the reality is that there are more than one sex. There are people born with different chromosomal combinations. There are people born with different genitalia that does not fit into either one of those binary categories. In fact, there are as many people born intersex as there are people born with red hair. So there's really, we've really kind of created this understanding of anatomical sex. So that's why I'm very clear to state that they're assigned at birth. So like, for example, I was assigned female at birth. On my birth certificate, it said, you know, female based on the way I was born. And as I moved through the world and kind of figured things out, I realized that that didn't really fit for me. So when you put all of these things together, those two terms together, I should say, the definition is that trans people are people who transcend the social roles assigned at birth based on anatomical sex. I should actually put in there assigned at birth. So that's the basic definition of what it means to be transgender, that we're literally transcending these social and cultural roles that were assigned to us at birth. So I wanted to talk about some stereotypes of gender roles to really kind of break down the difference between sex and gender. For some of you, I also want to say that for some of you, while some of this information might be something that you are very familiar with or that you already learned about in school or through other trainings, for some people this might be new. And so I'm really hoping that we can have a more robust conversation based on everyone's different experience level. And I think that's apparent based on a lot of the comments that were being made when we were specifically talking about cultural humility. There was clearly a lot of depth of experience in the room, and then there were a lot of really great questions. And so I'm hoping that we can continue to learn from each other in this process. So I want to throw it out to the group. I'm going to state what the differences are, and then I want you all to throw out some things at me. So when we're talking about masculinity and femininity, we're literally talking about more like social stereotypes, right? Like traits. And then when we're talking about sex, we're talking about physical characteristics and stereotypes of male and female. So this one, we're asking about gender. We're asking about masculinity and femininity, which is really more of the social stereotypes that are placed on people based on their gender. That was their gender identity. So, or what people would perceive as stereotypes for people that fall into these categories. So does anyone have, I'll throw out two just to start it. So for masculinity, we could say strong, right? Like, or we could say a breadwinner, right? For masculinity, that for masculinity, you're the breadwinner. Femininity, we could say a stereotype is a homemaker, right? Those are gender roles, right? We can get a lot broader than that though. So I'm going to ask y'all to take a minute and people can throw out, just specify whether you're saying it's masculine or feminine and throw some into the chat box. And Torlin will read them out as they come in.
One of the early comments that someone made earlier, just as we were waiting for people to share, is that they said, I learned in college that we do, and D is in exclamation points, gender. It's a choice, not necessarily to biological sex.
Right, exactly. You do gender. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to put it. Mm-hmm.
Right. And then now I'm getting information opposite / exclusive. Feminine weak, masculine strong.
Mm-hmm. I'll wait for a couple more before I move to the slide. I have more examples in the next slide, so don't worry.
Sure.
All right. I'll move to the next slide, and then if folks have ones they want to chime in about. So these are just some ones that I jotted down. If I was in a group with all of you, we'd have like a big whiteboard and we'd be writing stuff down. I'd probably be cracking a lot of really funny jokes. Yeah, so here are some to just show the difference between like and the gender binary in terms of stereotypes. So we've got, you know, tough for masculine, emotional, breadwinner, stoic, aggressive, boastful, ambitious, authoritative, certain, debonair, self-assured, courageous. Those are all stereotypes associated with masculine. And then feminine, a lot of the stereotypes we have are emotional, timid, spacey or flaky, drama queen, gossipy, indecisive, illogical, hysterical, passive, fragile, frightened. So what we're seeing here is like a real like breakdown, right, about stereotypes, and also it says a lot about sexism in our culture. But I do want to point out, and I shouldn't say culture, I should say in our society, because in different cultures, these are not necessarily the same. Like some communities have you know, stereotypes of women as being really strong, like heads of household, right? So, but it doesn't mean that a lot of these other stereotypes aren't built in as well. So, and I think that some of these stereotypes too for women from Black communities have been used in really racist ways, right? So like aggressive or authoritative, things like that could also, well, excuse me. Talking too much. Hold on.
So someone shared that yes, feminine traits listed are offensive. Someone shared early on that women are emotional, men are stoic. So we got some of those information that you placed on the chart.
Yeah, hold on one second.
Sure, absolutely. Oh, someone, I'm just gonna keep sharing if they come in.
Great.
Someone wrote feminine and then they used the B word. So
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good one.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, so we need to think about how also like some masculine, some traits that are considered even positive for masculine gender traits would actually be considered negative for feminine traits, right? And so I think it's important to look at that too, because what we know is that trans women of color experience violence at higher rates than most people in our society, in our country, and in the world, honestly. And there's a reason for that too, right? Because if you're giving up, right, like the way that a lot of people perceive that is you're taking on the traits of feminine traits that are considered lesser, right? And so that opens up to more violence, and it's totally connected to homophobia, right? And in the ways that people have experienced so much homophobic violence, so much transphobic violence. It doesn't mean that trans men and trans masculine people are not also subject to violence, but we see very high rates of violence in among trans women, and primarily, or not primarily, but even more so among trans women of color. So I'm going to move. Thank you all for letting me take a pause. I didn't even realize how much I was talking, and my body said take a pause. So, next I want to talk about some of the supposed sex characteristics of males and females. So, and that's implying that under this like binary idea, right, that there's only two, there's male and female. So I'll give an example of that, and then hopefully some folks can chime in with some more examples about supposed sex characteristics. So one example would be that, you know, men have, like, male is more associated with muscles, and that female is more associated with like weaker, slighter build, right? So that's an example. You can get as out there as you want. Like, don't worry about, because trust me, the next slide is gonna say all kinds of sex characteristics. So don't hold back. And I'll give you all a couple minutes or a minute, I should say, to chime in with some of those. For male and female. Anything coming through, Torlin?
Nope, nothing's coming through yet.
Okay. No pressure, y'all. I can go to the next slide.
So one of the statements just came out. Just one is that feminine is small waist, large breasts, long legs.
Yep. So here's a slide showing
that females are increased cold resistance. Men should be tall.
Yep. Yeah, those are great.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have, I broke down again into two categories here for male and female. So for male, we have hairy. Men have facial hair, muscles. They have a penis, testicles, big feet, large hands, maybe an Adam's apple. They're tall, broad shoulders, deep voice. Whereas female, long hair, not strong, no facial hair. They have a vagina, breasts, ovaries, menstruation, shorter, small hands, small feet, maybe a higher pitched voice. So the reason why I break all this down into categories is I want you to imagine that there's just lines being drawn back and forth throughout all these categories, because that's what this is for trans people, right? Like we transcend all of these categories. And it depends on how you hold yourself in the world. There is not one trans narrative. You'll hear me say that a million times during this presentation, that a trans person could have varying differences of these characteristics. Like when I walk through the world, I pretty much pass as a white cisgender man. Cisgender means that you are, it's spelled CISGENDER, so cisgender. And what that means is that you identify with the sex that you were assigned at birth. So my gender identity, like if I was born, born female, which I was, or assigned female at birth, and then I identified as a woman, I would be cisgender. My mother is cisgender. My father is cisgender, right? And so but I have ovaries. I have a uterus, right? Like these are things that when I'm walking down the street, somebody might not, would never assume that, right? And again, I am sharing this information with you. This is one of those moments where I just told you what my reproductive organs are, right? That is not something that would ever be appropriate to ask someone who is trans. Really, it's not appropriate to ask anyone, right? Like I don't ask people what's in their pants. I expect that people won't ask me what's in my pants. But like I said, I'm using myself as an example very consensually in this process. And we'll talk more about not asking people about what's in their pants when we get a little bit, as we keep moving here. So I want to talk a little bit about identities here, which is that there's a lot of different ways that people can identify their gender. A lot of people hear this term gender nonconforming, which is actually being used a little bit less lately, but it is used to refer to individuals who transgress gender in different ways, but who may not also identify as transgender. So somebody might also identify as transgender and identify as gender nonconforming, but a lot of people experience the oppression that a lot of trans people experience, but might not actually identify as trans. And I think this comes up a lot with people who maybe were assigned male at birth and maybe still identify as men, but who really play with gender and maybe cross a lot of lines in terms of the way that they present their gender, right? Like they might, wear dresses sometimes, or paint their nails, or do all kinds of different things that might feel really beautiful and powerful to them, but they might not identify as trans. There's also a lot of folks who identify as butch. Maybe they're butch lesbians, butch, or maybe they just identify as butch, who often experience oppression as somebody who crosses or who transcends gender, they experience that oppression, but they might not actually identify as trans. So there's also non-binary identities, which refers to identifying your gender outside of traditional gender roles of man and woman. So that's really somebody who doesn't, like for me, like I use he, him pronouns, but I don't identify as a man and I don't identify as a woman. That does not resonate with me. I have a lot of, I feel like my socialization as a woman is very important to me. I was identified in the world as a woman until I was like 30, 31 before I did any medical transition. Again, I'm sharing a lot with you for illustrating purposes. But I never felt like being a man was never something that made sense to me either. So, like I said, I learned a lot from young people, and I finally, after many, many years, found an identity that makes sense to me. And maybe in 5 years, somebody else will come up with something that also really makes sense to me. I always joke that I say that I'm going to be in transition for the rest of my life. And I find that to be empowering, actually.
Right.
So,
can I share with you a comment someone shared?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one person shared, I disagree with the use of transcending language. There are many trans folk who claim these binary labels or categories for their own identity as opposed to rejecting them. I think the point about there's not being one trans narrative should include folks who do claim these categories.
Well, can you clarify that a little more? I'm a little. Do you mean like people who exist within the binary? Like people who embrace the binary? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah, I agree with you 100%. Yeah, I think that there's power in people identifying within the binary as well. I want to just make space for people who also don't identify within the binary. And I think there's a lot of privilege that people have when they identify within the binary, but there's also a lot of privilege that people don't have, and a lot of oppression that people experience from also identifying as like a trans woman or a trans man, and that's also really powerful, and they also experience a lot of oppression. So in no way do I mean to state that there's something that shouldn't be celebrated or about people also identifying with the binary. I think there's a lot of power in being like a fierce femme, or being like a fierce butch, or just being like identifying your gender in any way that feels good to you. And that's the main point that I want to get out of this, is that there's a lot of ways to identify your gender, and that they should all be celebrated, and that we shouldn't put people in boxes that they don't want to be in. Does that make sense? I don't know if the person who made the comment wants to chat.
They basically said, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, okay, cool. So another term that's currently being used, which is like pretty, which I think is pretty amazing, is this idea, is this term gender expansive. And so it really, this has again been coined by young people in the last couple years. And it's really this idea of, instead of saying that you're not conforming to something, that you're saying that your idea of gender is really expansive, and that that gives a lot of room for like change and growth, and it's a positive term, as opposed to saying that you're not conforming with something. It's saying that your view of gender is expansive, and that your identity might be expansive as well. So it's just a term that I've been hearing a lot. My partner is a high school teacher, and she is the advisor for their Sexualities and Genders Alliance at the high school she works at. And so I hear a lot from her, so it helps keep me a little bit more in touch. And then also through the work I do with the Name Change Mobilization. So I'm excited to see what's to come in terms of gender identities. Here we go. So I wanted to talk about intersex identity as well, but there's this short film here, and that the person on that image there, Pigeon, is actually lives in Chicago and is an activist here. And so they're gonna, and along with 3 other folks who identify as intersex, are gonna talk a little bit about intersex identity, and then I will circle back and add a few other things about intersex identity once we watch this video.
If you have testes. I'm pigeon, I'm Alex, I'm Natalie, and we are intersecting. Intersex is not a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of being. Identify as a queer gender non-conforming intersex person. Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. It's probably an awesome fact source if you think about it. Transgender has to do with gender identity, whereas intersex has to do with biology.
So Ivy, it sounds a little choppy or warped.
Huh. Okay. I don't know why. Let me see why that's happening. Was it, were you able to hear it at all, or was it just totally?
Sounds a little choppy, a little warbled.
Okay.
Hard for people to make out the words.
All right, let me try it again and see if maybe if I start it over, I could also go directly to the, website and see if it will come through better. We'll get an annoying commercial, so I apologize.
It's so important. It really is.
Raise your hands if you have testes.
That's better.
Okay, great.
I'm pigeon, I'm Alex, I'm Natalie, I'm Fred, and we are intersecting.
Oh, okay.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of being.
Still sounds the same way, Ivy.
Huh. Well, I don't really know why that's happening, unless it's an internet related issue. So, because it's
probably be helpful if you would like to share the closed captioning, maybe that would help.
Okay, let's see here. I think I can do that over here. All right, I'll do that.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
I'm pigeon, I'm Alex, I'm Natalie, I'm Fred, and we are intersecting. Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of being. Identify as a queer gender non-conforming intersex person. Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. It's probably an awesome fact source if you think about it. Transgender has to do with gender identity, whereas intersex has to do with
something felt like a war.
All right. So here, let me get back to the slideshow here. So I think that you know, it's important to know that we even have, there's even intersex surgeries happening in Chicago right now. There are Lurie Children's Hospital actually houses one of the programs that does a lot of work with transgender young people. They have their gender clinic there. We get a lot of referrals from them for the name change mobilization, but that the same hospital that provides that space also is still performing intersex surgeries. So there's been a lot of activism that's been done by folks in intersex communities in Chicago around getting them to stop doing the surgeries that are not medically necessary, and to allow people to have to consent to the surgeries when they're able to, and if that's something that they would even want. And so it's we have a lot of stigma to overcome around intersex identities, and like I said earlier, there's as many people born intersex as there are people born with red hair, and I think that's a really good visual, at least for me, was a very good visual to have an understanding of how pervasive this understanding is in our culture, that there are only two sexes and that it's actually just not rooted in science. And I think there's so much silence and shame for folks who are intersex or identify that way, that that we don't hear a lot about it. And so my hope is to try to reduce some of that stigma by having an open conversation, or at least by building awareness around oppression of folks who are intersex, and very, like, I mean, to have surgeries, you know, that aren't necessary is pretty dramatic. And I also to really point out the difference between folks who may identify as trans and folks who identify as intersex. You can identify as trans and identify as intersex, but they are not synonymous with each other. And I think that that's an important thing to point out. And my hope is that because we went through the difference between gender and sex, that you know, thinking about it in that way helps understand that difference between intersex and trans identities. So before moving on to the next slide, I just want to see if there's any questions, because we're gonna move into talking about another topic. There's a lot to cover, so but if
nope, there's nothing at this point. We're good.
All right. So so now I want to kind of along the same vein that we've been talking about, is talking about the transgender umbrella. I think that this is a term that that we hear a lot, and I think it can be valuable just to get a full understanding of how many people's identities might be considered transgender. But I also think that by placing everyone under the same umbrella, that it can give the false understanding that people experience the same oppressions based on their trans identity alone. And so I wanted to point out very specifically that a lot of people who may fall under the umbrella do not experience the same form of discrimination in terms of housing, employment, medical care, things like that. And in the way that we were talking about intersectionality in the last section, that using myself again as an example, that like my access and the barriers that I experience are very different than somebody who comes from a different community that experiences a lot more intersectional oppression than I do. So while we might share an identity, we don't share the same histories or realities of oppression. And I think that's really important, which is why you will never ever hear me use the term trans community. I typically don't use the word community in a broad way to describe anybody or any group of people, because I feel like there are communities, right? Like there's no one gay community, there is no one transgender community, there's no one LGBTQ community, because we all experience things so dramatically differently. You know, like a rich white gay man's experience is very, very different than a transgender woman of color who's incarcerated in our prisons and jails in the United States for either a crime that she may have not committed or a survival crime or whatever. I mean, I could go down a rabbit hole on my politics around our criminal legal system, but I just want to point out that like trying to put those two people in the same community is invisibilizing. It invisibilizes the person who experiences the level of oppression she does. And then it also makes that person who has an extreme amount of privilege feel like they are not part of the problem, right? And so I want to make that very clear, that like just because somebody falls under like the LGBTQ umbrella in general does not mean that they are not part of oppressive systems that subjugate others and that subjugate other LGBTQ folks. So it's a big distinction I want to make, and it's why I specifically bring up this umbrella. And there's a lot of different identities that could fall under this umbrella, and a lot of terms that change and over time, right? We already have talked about some. We talked about gender expansive, gender nonconforming, butch, femme, transgender, non-binary. The list goes on. And then there's a lot of terms that are no longer used anymore that would also fall under this umbrella, but different people of different generations still use a lot of these terms, right? So there's, you don't hear the term transsexual used as often as it used to be. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's also very rooted in this idea of surgery. And so we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but just to be aware that just because somebody identifies as LGBTQ does not, or within one of those identities, does not mean that they aren't part of the same oppressive systems that are harming people that would fall under that same category. And honestly, we've seen that play out in a lot of different contexts. I'll give an example that really sticks out for me. There was this, I can't remember the exact year. I want to say it was definitely like pre-2014. There was this whole incident that happened at Pride in Lakeview, and there was this whole like quote Take Back Boys Town movement that happened, and it was mostly being promoted by white gay men. And first of all, like, how do you take back something? I think that that's a really dangerous concept, because the reality is that we live on stolen land. So who owns Lakeview is like, how do you take back something that you don't own? And I remember going to this big town hall they had to move it to an elementary school because so many people were coming to, I think it was like a CAPS meeting or something. And because there was so much like turmoil happening in Boys Town around this. And there were a lot of white gay men in attendance, and there were a lot of young LGBTQ folks of color in attendance, and to have their voices heard about what their experience was in Lakeview around policing and around so many things. And I will never forget just hearing white gay men shouting at a trans woman of color who was trying to tell her story about her experiences, and they were shouting at her, "Get a job." So I say that it's not to demean like white gay men in general, but it's to say that like we do have a divide here, and to try to say that there's one community or that even there's one trans community is, I think, a disservice, and it doesn't help us in our path towards cultural humility to see where we are part of the problem, right? And how we can actually work towards dismantling racism and oppression. So the next place I want to move into is talking about self-determination, which is frankly what we've been talking about most of this time, is the idea that we all have the right to have full power over our own lives, right? That as individuals and communities, that we should be able to self-determine our own lives. And this is something that we work towards building for a lot of our clients, but it's really hard to do when we are moving through systems that are so oppressive to so many of the folks that we work with.
So can I share this comment before you take a step further?
Yeah, absolutely.
Someone shared, it is sometimes difficult to juggle competing vulnerable populations who feel and are actually physically threatening to one another. So is there any thoughts on that? And then someone said, thank you for clarifying. What a lot of people do not know or are blind to is that racism is a big issue in the community.
Yeah. I think I might need can you repeat the first
So the first part of the statement is, it is sometimes difficult to juggle competing vulnerable populations who feel and are actually physically threatening to one another.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are seeing that play out in so many different ways and right now in our city. And I think that, and I hope I'm going down the right path with this, but I mean, in terms of what the comment was, but I think that white supremacy is really insidious, right? And I think it plays out in so many different ways. And I say white supremacy specifically because I think it's interconnected with transphobia and homophobia and heterosexism and all of these things. And that what ends up happening is that we see communities, even communities that are both oppressed and both at risk of violence, actually perpetuating that violence against each other, right? We saw that a lot in the past week in certain communities where we had brown people attacking Black people, right? And there's a reason for that, because the way that our systems are set up, they're set up to divide people. That's how people stay in control of power. At least that's my perspective. When you have communities that are both being oppressed by the state, right? We have people locked up at the border in cages, and then we have people like brown people, and then we have Black people and brown people locked up all over and I would argue they're Black and brown people locked up in cages at the border as well, because you can be Black and be Latinx. And then we have all of these communities that are locked up in cages all over the country in prisons and jails. And then the system divides people so that then they don't unite together, right? It's very insidious. And so I think that is a challenge for us as service providers also, is to figure out how to bridge those differences when we're working with clients who are maybe from communities that are different than ours and from communities that we're a part of. I hope that addressed what the person was bringing up, but if they want more feedback or to continue the conversation, I'd be interested to hear.
Perfect, thank you.
Oh, okay, all right, cool. Y'all, I just want to give y'all a shout out because I know this is like a really weird platform to be doing this in, and you all are bringing such really good questions and comments, and it makes it a better experience for everyone. So I wanted to just give everyone a shout out for that. So some of the aspects of self-determination that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about pronouns, we're going to talk about transition, sexual orientation versus gender identity, and then we're going to talk about names, and then surgeries and hormone therapy. So I'm gonna move through this and then this section, and then when we get to the end, we can see if there's any comments or questions, or if Torlin, if something pops up and you're like, oh no, we got to do this now. I trust you. You've been doing an excellent job of like stepping in. So thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So pronouns. So as you can see from this list of pronouns here, there's a lot of different pronouns in there. And I want to talk first about like what's the right way to interact with someone around pronouns, and then I want to specifically talk about they them pronouns, because I think that what I've seen in my work is that, and in my communities, is that seems to be a pronoun that people really struggle with, and I want to address that. So one, the very first thing I will say is that if you are not sure what someone's pronoun is, the best thing you could do is to simply ask someone. A lot of people use different pronouns. I think we really have a job to do, especially in our agency settings where we can normalize the use of asking pronouns. The reason why I, like at the beginning, I told you my pronouns, and if we were in a room together, I would have had everyone say their name and pronoun. Whenever I run a meeting, whenever I am at a partner meeting, whenever I'm participating in someone else's meeting, whatever it is, I'm always going to say what my pronouns are, even if the meeting hasn't been set up to make space for that, because I feel like that's a way that we can model. I also have had in trainings, I've had people come out for the first time in a training because we made space for them to be able to state their pronouns. And because they saw that every time we met, no matter if we meet every single day, we're always going to do that same check-in, because it always is going to then make space for people to change or transition. Or some people use multiple pronouns, and maybe one day they feel more comfortable in one pronoun versus the other. But to have somebody sit there and say, I just want to say this is the first time that I've ever stated that these are the pronouns I want to use, is a really powerful thing to witness. And it means that a space has been created where someone felt comfortable enough to come out and say that. You will also not ever hear me say safe space. I don't really think that concept is, especially not in our country where there's so many different intersecting forms of oppression. I don't really think that safe spaces really exist. And so I don't ever want to set somebody up to say like this is a safe space, because it might ultimately not be a safe space. I also think it's a really privileged concept. I think a lot of people live in really, really unsafe communities. And so really trying to shine a light on that concept of safety and what it means, because I think a lot of white people use the concept of safety to perpetuate violence against communities of color. So saying all that to like set a framework for why I talk about things the way that I do. So again, if you're not sure, like if you're meeting with someone and you're like, I'm not sure what that person's pronoun is, I guarantee you it might feel awkward for a minute, but that person either is going to learn something from you asking them their pronoun, because maybe nobody's ever asked them before, and maybe they're not a trans person. And if they're a trans person, you're immediately setting yourself up to show that person that you might be somebody that could be supportive of them, that maybe you're an ally or an accomplice, and that you can, and that you're somebody that has an understanding of trans identities, and that can be really affirming for folks, especially in a workspace or in your personal life. And if you discover that you've been using the wrong pronoun, this is really, really important, is that politely correcting yourself and moving on. Because one thing is for sure, and this is along the lines for like multiple forms of oppression, that somebody who is experiencing the oppression should not be the one who then has to do the emotional labor to take care of you in the process. So what I've had happen is somebody messes up your pronoun and then they go on a long explanation for why they did it and how bad they feel and like da 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 da. Or the one that I hear the most is, I'm old, I can't learn this, whatever. I have a 79-year-old aunt who from jump never messed up my pronouns. My grandmother was 93 years old, and when I finally told her that I changed my name, she took my hand and she said, my Avi, and then never messed up my pronouns. It is possible, and I'm very lucky that I had people in my life like that. But age is not an excuse. I hear that excuse more than anything. And yes, it takes time. I screw things up. It's okay to make mistakes. I screw up people's pronouns sometimes. You just correct yourself and you move on. You correct yourself, I apologize, or you don't even have to say that. You can be like, I mean blank, and move on. It's just nobody should have to do that emotional labor to take care of you. And I think that crosses contexts, right? Or like different scenarios. It's the same thing around so many different issues of oppression, that somebody who is being oppressed should not have to take care of somebody else's feelings around how they feel about oppressing you, right? It's just, nobody should have to do that emotional labor. If you see somebody else unintentionally or intentionally mispronouncing somebody, and a lot of times it's unintentional, honestly, but it's about the impact, right? Not the intention. And so you can, if the situation feels like you're that your safety is not at risk, or if you feel comfortable, you should you can interrupt someone who is mispronouncing another person. I say this with a caveat. I am somebody who, I'm a little anxious. I'm a little anxious Jew. It's true, and I rhymed there. I didn't even mean to. And call out like those kinds of public corrections can make some people uncomfortable, right? Can make some people feel anxious. Maybe the person that is mispronouncing them is not somebody that person even wants to be out to. So what I would always recommend is, if you notice that happening, it's okay to check in with the person who was mispronounced and to say, hey, I noticed that so-and-so has been mispronouncing you. I just wanted to check in to see if you're comfortable with me correcting them, because I want to be a support to you. That's a really appropriate way to check in with somebody about it, and to find out like what would feel good for them in terms of you being a good ally. It's another thing to like address systemic issues within your agency, right? Like if you're noticing somebody that's just mispronouncing everybody and mispronouncing people all the time, like that's a different situation, right? You can then, or if you're noticing that one person is just being really transphobic, it's different to address somebody about something like that. But if it's like an individual instance and you're not sure, or let's say you're going to a friend's house, a friend's family's house, and you know this person by one pronoun, but you know that that maybe things with their family aren't, you know, like they're not totally out or whatever. You always want to make sure that you're asking that person what pronoun they want you to use around their family, right? So there's a lot of different situations where you can, like simple little things like making sure that you're using someone's pronouns correctly can be a huge affirmation for folks, and can let people know that you might be an ally to them. Any questions about pronouns before we move on? Oh, I almost forgot. I wanted to talk about they, them pronouns. So I want to talk about they, them pronouns. One of the most common pushbacks that I hear about they, them pronouns is that it's not grammatically correct. It's plural, like I don't think it's right. They should think of something else. So first of all, I want to say language is malleable. And two, I also want to say that there's a long history of they and them being used in the singular. It's been in the English language for a very, very long time. some examples of they, them pronouns are like, let's say somebody dropped a $10 bill on the ground and you picked it up and you were like, oh, I saw that they dropped this on the ground. They, right? That's a singular version of you using the they. So it's definitely, there's grammatical precedence for it. But regardless of that, that shouldn't even really matter, because I think that when people are trying to find new ways to identify gender, that we can be really creative in the ways that we think. There's a lot of other pronouns that you can see up there, like ZHE for Z or XE, instead of using he or she. Those terms were used a lot more. Z was used a lot, like ZE without the H. There's a lot of different pronouns that have been used over time. But they, them seems to have really been a pronoun that a lot of folks in non-binary communities are using to identify themselves and for their pronouns. So any questions about they, them pronouns before we move on?
No, we're good at this point.
Okay, great. So I want to talk about transition. So y'all heard me say earlier that I feel like I'll be in transition for the rest of my life, which I think is kind of amazing. I love being trans. It's something that I feel like has been, of course, it comes with being complicated. It comes with all the trauma associated, but like also there's a lot of beauty in being able to be able to acknowledge a lifelong transition. For some people, there's a very, very clear endpoint for transition. And so I want to, again, state that there is not one trans narrative, just like there's not one like human narrative, right? Everyone's experience is different. Some people from the earliest they can remember felt dysphoric in their bodies, meaning that like they knew like from as soon as they could like have conscious thought about their body, that their body wasn't the right one for them. Other people don't discover their trans identities until much later in life. Some people might want surgeries, other people might not want surgeries. Some people might want to go on hormones, some people don't want to go on hormones. Some people have a very clear list of things that they need in order to feel comfortable in their own body. And to not have like extreme mental health impacts due to that dysphoria. And so it really runs the gamut, really. There's so many different ways to be trans, but the definition of transition is really the term that some people use to refer to the period of their lives where they're crossing from one gender identity or expression to the other. So to another. And so that doesn't mean that it's like from 1 to 2, like male to female or female to male or man to woman. It can be so broad. It can mean so many things. And transition can look in so many different ways for so many people, right? Like I'll use myself as an example again of like the way that the outside world perceives you can really impact the way that you even identify with your gender. So before I felt comfortable, and when I felt like I was constantly fighting when I was younger, fighting against these ideas of femininity, I would never wear pink or willingly, or I didn't want to be associated with things that were feminine. And then as soon as I became comfortable in my presentation in my body, I'm like, bring it on. I'm like, I wear pink and purple sparkly things all the time. I like to paint my nails. I like to do all kinds of things that like were not part of my reality when I was fighting against like feeling like I was being put in a box, right? So the more that for some people, the more that we strip away those categories and let people live their true authentic, be their true authentic selves, the sky could be the limit for how people play with gender or quote do gender, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about what transitions look like for different people. and when we talk specifically about surgeries and hormones. So I also want to make very clear that gender identity and sexual orientation are not synonymous. Sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. Gender identity is about how you identify your gender. So just like anybody else, LGBTQ or trans people can be LGBTQ, they can be straight. A lot of trans people identify as straight. A lot of trans folks identify as queer, as anything. Like there's a lot of trans folks who identify as gay men, who identify as lesbian. You can be any sexuality while still being trans. So the two they're entirely separate things. And this is just an illustration because I feel like I can't do any sort of training on LGBTQ things without a unicorn. So here's the unicorn. And this is a really good graphic, I feel like, that helps break down the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and like who you're physically attracted to versus who you're emotionally attracted to. So there's a lot of different ways that people can identify their gender, and then also have a gender expression, right? So I might identify as non-binary, but my gender expression runs the gamut. Like sometimes I might be throwing like more of a feminine gender expression, and sometimes I might be more masculine, right? But that doesn't change my gender identity, right? I might be physically attracted to specific types of people, but I might be emotionally attracted to other types of people. So this kind of shows that there's more of a continuum, and just shows how broad these categories are. Like I said earlier, we get to think big, right? So next does anyone have any questions before I move on? Is there anything that came through, Torlin?
Nope, we're good.
Okay. So next I want to talk about names. So I have been asked this so many times, and I've been asked by employers before what my quote old name was or what my real name is. It's never appropriate to ask somebody about their name. If somebody wants to tell you about that, they'll definitely offer that up. In my work with the name change mobilization, I've helped over 1,000 people change their names, and the term that we hear very, very often from trans folks is referring to the name they were assigned at birth as their quote dead name. So just to give people an idea of like how traumatic the association with the name can be for people, that they would refer to it as their dead name. For some people, there's a lot of trauma that's associated with that name. A lot of people have been trying to live their authentic selves, and that's not something that they feel comfortable sharing. Other people might feel comfortable sharing that, and that might be part of their process too, right? I don't particularly feel comfortable sharing my name. I'm really open about a lot of things. Like I never changed my gender marker on my birth certificate. It wasn't really important to me. But for some people, it's a crucial, crucial part in their step towards living their being their authentic self, right? And to live that self-determined life.
So I have a question for you, Avi, just very quickly. It's like, how do you go about asking the person's name when filling out entitlement benefits?
Right. So the way that I approach that's a really, really good question. Typically, if I'm working with somebody and I know that that they might have a prior name, or even if they don't, you can always just say to people, so I'm not sure like if the name that you provided is your legal name, but unfortunately we have to put legal names on these documents because it's going to the federal government or the state government. And so that's usually how I approach it, is I just tell people like, you know, we have to put the legal name down. And for some people who've never been able to have a name change, one, that's also a good opportunity for folks if they maybe don't know about programs like the name change mobilization, to be like, have you ever wanted assistance with getting your name changed? Unfortunately, people with a felony conviction in Illinois have a 10-year bar to getting their name changed, which is something we're trying to fight through in collaboration with the ACLU and Chicago House and the Transformative Justice Law Project. We're working together on that, both in a legislative bill, and we're trying to change that law through a federal, through a constitutional challenge in federal court around First Amendment and some other things, but I won't get into it. But basically, that's a good opportunity, one, to see if somebody needs resources, and two, the best thing to do is just say, hey, like, unfortunately, I have to put legal names down. And then if somebody doesn't want to say their legal name out loud, which I usually offer people, I say, hey, like, you don't have to say it out loud, but if you want to just give me your like current ID or driver's license, if they have one, then you can just like write it down from that so they don't have to say it out loud. I do that all the time at the name change mobilization. I'm just like, hey, do you have a current ID? Because then it kind of takes away that pressure from them feeling like they have to say their name out loud, their legal name. So any other questions about names? Okay.
Nope, we're good.
All right. So moving into surgeries and hormone therapy. So I always state this, like, very, like, medical options are a personal decision. So some people really just have no desire to get any type of surgery or any type of, to be on hormones or anything. Some people might just want to be on hormones. Some people might only want to have a type of surgery and not be on hormones. And then this is also an important piece, is that some people literally cannot, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some is access, right? Like access to resources. These surgeries are expensive. More and more insurance companies are starting to cover surgeries. Medicaid is covering surgeries. Medicare is covering surgeries. Great. But there's also not a lot of consistent information, so you can always refer people to, you know, Howard Brown has a lot of information. You can refer, like around name changes, you can refer people to TJLP. You can also refer people to Chicago House. There's some other resources as well. But to not make an assumption that somebody wants to have a specific surgery or go through a specific medical process, and to really ask people, how can I support you in your transition? What does it look like? What does your transition look like for you? And how can I support you in that? Some people have medical reasons, right? Like some people might have other medical conditions that makes it so that they can't go on hormones, or that they can't go, they can't have surgery, right? There's a lot of reasons why that might not be possible for people. And so asking people if they've had, quote, a surgery yet is never appropriate. One, first of all, like, what the heck is that? I mean, we all know what people mean when they say the surgery. They're referring to genital surgery, right? It's never appropriate to ask somebody that question. I cannot stress that enough. Just like I said earlier, like, I'm not going to ask somebody what's in their pants. Like, it's really nobody's business what's in my pants, or like what I want to do with my body. So I just really want to drive that home. There's a lot of people that, like I've said, I'll say it again. I feel like this is one of the points I really want to drive home, is that there are so many different ways to transition. And no matter how someone transitions, all genders should be respected and celebrated without regard for a hierarchy based on medical interventions and procedures. And I think we see a lot of hierarchy even within trans communities about how well somebody passes. And I feel like that's really complicated, and it's also harder for me to speak to that, being from, you know, my specific positionality in the world as a white trans masculine person. But there definitely is a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of shame that can be perpetuated through what a lot of people call passing privilege, which is where people have more privilege in the world because they're able to pass as the quote pass as the gender that they identify with. And so really being mindful that that we're not negatively impacting the mental health of people within our own communities as trans people as well. And then also a lot of cisgender straight people and cisgender LGBTQ people like overly affirm people who pass really well and almost tokenize them. I've seen white gay men literally like showcase a trans woman of color who passes really well and say, doesn't she look amazing, right? Like, why is that something that they're focusing on? Because really what you're hearing then is you're hearing that person say, doesn't she look like a quote real woman, right? And like, what does that mean? Because then also we're implying that trans women aren't women. And it's tokenizing of that person's identity as well. So we have to be really careful on how we place value on the way people look and the way people express their gender. Does anyone have any questions on that, Torlin, or comments?
No, we're good.
Okay. So next I want to talk about disclosing identity and outing. And I feel like this is a lot more complex and I've even learned a lot. I shouldn't say I have learned a lot in the last year about this as well. Because I think as a trans person, I often will make the assumption that because somebody is fierce and trans and that they live their life as like an openly queer person or LGBTQ person, that means that they're really open to people knowing that they're trans. And so I want to just point out that it's up to each individual to decide if they want to disclose their gender history to others. So regardless of the circumstances, even if you're working within an LGBTQ organization, there should never be an assumption that somebody wants to be outed as trans. Like that person might just want to be want people to perceive them as a gay man, not a gay trans man. Or they might want to be perceived as a, as a straight woman or as a LGBTQ woman or whatever. So to make the assumption that just because somebody is trans and they're like, that doesn't mean that they want that to be their primary identity or that they want that to be disclosed. On the flip, we're not even on the flip, but in addition to that, it's never okay to disclose anyone's sexual orientation or gender identity unless they have told you that it is okay to do that. It's a serious safety concern, and it's also disrespectful because that's somebody else's story to tell. And you never know what kind of harm you're going to be causing somebody by outing somebody. It can be very, very, very dangerous for people. So that's always something that unless you have been told you can out somebody, don't do it. I am letting you all know that you can tell anyone you want that I'm trans. But so I'm saying that out loud to you all right now. But that situation might feel very different for me if I was arrested or something like that, right? So it's complicated. There's a lot of layers. There's a lot of safety concerns. So moving into talking about gendered space. So we've kind of, just to state this, I want to realize I moved out of, so when we ended with surgeries and hormone therapy, we moved out of talking specifically about self-determination. And when we moved into talking about disclosing identity and outing, we're more moving into situations where people experience violence within trans communities. So gendered spaces and facilities, some of you work in residential facilities, some of you may work in shelters. We historically have seen really high rates of violence against trans people within these gendered spaces. So that's really including prisons, jails, group homes, shelters, restrooms, locker rooms. When spaces are explicitly gendered, folks who fall outside of those perceived social norms can be subjected to really extreme violence, harassment, and discrimination. And it doesn't even have to be extreme. It can like whittle away at people over time. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're causing this harm to people. So, for example, if you work in agencies where there's only a men's room and a women's room, there's already people are already being exposed to violence in those situations if they only have those two options to choose from, right? People should never be policed in these spaces. Their gender should never be policed. We see that within prisons and jails and group homes and shelters, that a lot of the violence and discrimination that people experience is at the hands of the people that work there, and not always from the people who are also utilizing those services. That can happen, but what we see is that it comes more from the people who work there. Trans women face extreme violence from correctional officers in prisons and jails. I've been, I've had many conversations with trans women of color who have been incarcerated in Illinois and in Cook County who have experienced violence at the hands of correctional officers and staff by medical providers within the jails and prisons as well. So, and then in group homes and in shelters, we hear about it all the time. There is not a single adult shelter in the city of Chicago that is for LGBTQ adults or for trans adults. That is a huge gap in services. I know of one shelter that has a couple beds, but that's it. We have a youth shelter, the Crib, through the night ministry, but there's no adult shelter. So people literally have nowhere to go where they can know that they won't experience violence based on their identity. And the largest homeless shelter in the city is Pacific Garden Mission, which is not a space where trans people can go safely. And again, I say safely with the understanding of what safety, the complication with that term, but they can't go there without being subjected to violence, whether that's violence physically or emotionally, right? So I'm gonna talk now about any comments coming in about any of that.
No, but I want to start off with this comment previous is that people are often denied services due to their gender marker on their insurance. Do you know a good way to navigate this? And then someone shared that Sarah Circle house trans women in our interim housing program.
Yes, and that Sarah Circle was the exact org that I was referencing when I said I know that there's an org with some beds. So thank you for shouting that out. You were actually the org I was referring to. So, and that's the only one in the city. So that's, I mean, we house a lot of trans identified folks in our housing at Chicago House, but in terms of emergency shelters, there's no emergency shelter, right? And that's a big problem. The question about the gender marker. So I think that there has to be some more advocacy done with the insurance company directly, unfortunately, in that situation. And I can relate to that because I very intentionally put an F down when I fill out my insurance forms because I want to ensure that my reproductive health care gets covered and that I don't have to fight with the insurance company. So it becomes a personal decision about what people want to put on their insurance forms, but unfortunately, they may have to do some advocacy or seek out advocacy through like different legal projects that advocate for folks with insurance companies. So, I mean, I know Chicago House's trans legal program would probably, Elizabeth Ricks is the attorney. She would probably be able to assist with something like that. So if you need resources, if somebody's like directly experiencing that, like I would reach out to Elizabeth. But yeah, it's a problem, and it also depends on the provider that people are going to, right? So if Howard Brown knows how to like code things so that people, so that trans people are getting their coverage, right? But like if you're going to a provider that doesn't provide trans healthcare, they might not know how to advocate for that person for making sure that their stuff gets covered. So yeah, it's a problem. We need the insurance companies to catch up. And they're just starting to, through pressure, through like legislative and like because of the ACA, there was a bunch of like you used to be able to, insurance companies used to be able to discriminate against people just because they're trans. So like, for example, I had a friend, this was like probably 10 years ago or 8 years ago, who needed to apply for a private insurance through Blue Cross Blue Shield. And they were denied insurance. This was before the ACA. They were denied insurance for having a pre-existing condition. And the pre-existing condition was that they took testosterone as a trans person. So we've come a little bit away in the last, 5 years or so with, and really in the last 2 years with the insurance companies. But yeah, you could get denied coverage on the private market just for being trans within the last 10 years. So it's a big problem that there needs to be continued advocacy around. Any other comments coming through, Torlin?
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now I want to talk about, we're going to talk about specifically about barriers. So within trans communities, particularly among, I mean, this happens in LGBT communities, but a lot of trans women of color are experience these barriers to education, but trans people in general do. So we see higher dropout rates at all levels of education due to harassment and discrimination. Imagine if you literally could not go to the bathroom all day long because there wasn't a bathroom for you to use, right? How that impacts your education environment. What if your teachers are transphobic? What if your principal is transphobic and you're experiencing transphobia in your own household? If you're forced to use locker rooms where you're frequently going to be subjected to violence and persecution, nobody should ever police people in bathrooms. And in the state of Illinois, there are protections in place, both on the state level, then we have city protections and we have county protections around people being able to use the restroom that comports with their gender identity. That person gets to decide their gender identity. Nobody else gets to decide for them whether they belong in that space. We have a serious issue with lack of training and accountabilities for teachers and administrators. The Illinois Safe School Alliance has been doing a lot of work around trying to train and train teachers and administrators and to help advocate for students in schools across Illinois. And then we also have the issue of people's identity documents not matching the name that they use. And so I used preferred names there, but I need to like go back and edit this slide. But people are moving away from using the term preferred name because it doesn't give the weight of the fact that this is somebody's name. It's not a preference, it just is their name. And so that is something that I'll take out moving forward. But that, we see issues with students not being able to get an ID that has their chosen name on it, right? And for some people, they might not be able to get a name change as easily under 18 if their parents aren't consenting. And so if, or maybe both parents aren't consenting to the name change, and that can be really complicated. If one parent is consenting and the other isn't, we've never had a situation where somebody came to the name change mobilization and said they wanted to get their name changed as a minor and weren't able to. but sometimes it's harder work to help that person. And if neither parent is consenting, then there's a whole argument that has to be made to the court about the best interest of the child. And can you imagine being like a teenager or younger and having to literally have a legal battle against your parents? That's a lot to ask for a young person, for anybody really. So these are some of the barriers that we see in terms of people being able to get an education, which then sets them up for so many more barriers in life after that. We also see barriers to housing, right? Where trans and gender nonconforming folks and gender expansive folks are disproportionately represented in homeless and street-based communities. And this is because of what we were just talking about, right? Like people get kicked out of their homes, people drop out of school. There's no safe affirming, there's no like affirming places for people to access like ongoing care as young people, like affirming shelters, group homes, so many housing programs. Like you get a case manager who is transphobic, you know, and you don't always get to pick who your case manager is going to be, right? Like you're on the coordinated entry system, and then maybe you get pulled for a housing program where your case manager is vehemently opposed to your identity, right? I mean, these are really, there's so many things happening here. Or you go to a shelter where you experience violence or discrimination. So we also see barriers to housing in the process of even getting an apartment, right? Where like a landlord might discriminate against you because they identify you as trans or as you know, not conforming to the gender binary. Or I've seen landlords give people extra talks, right, who are trans. I was working with a trans client who the landlord literally gave her a whole speech about how she couldn't run businesses out of her apartment and that she couldn't do hair out of her apartment. And the client never brought anything like this up at all, but the landlord identified her as a trans woman of color and then immediately had an entirely different conversation with her than she would have with any other person seeking to live in one of her buildings, right? So there was already this like, from jump, like this kind of policing mentality around and stereotypes around this person moving into her building. And then barriers to employment. So same with housing, right? Discrimination based on gender presentation, identity documents that don't match. Prior to the Obama administration, there were Social Security used to literally send no match letters, which was where they, like, let's say you put down, let's say I was to put down an M on my employment application or my paperwork for Social Security. And then when the employer sent the documentation into Social Security, then Social Security would send a letter back saying that the gender identity did not match what Social Security had on file, essentially outing people with their employers. So Obama changed that, and luckily it has not gone back yet since Trump has been in office. Also, we talked about outing earlier, like outing people as trans can lead to discrimination and violence. And unfortunately, a lot of the legal remedies and protections that are available for folks are often really inaccessible and frankly ineffective unless you have a really solid case, and unavailable depending on certain jurisdictions. So like we actually have a pretty high level of protections in Chicago, because we have the state level, then the county has protections and then the city does, but a lot of places do not experience that in the same way that we do at all. And then even the protections we do have in place here are sometimes really hard. Like you can file a claim that your human rights were violated, but a lot of times those don't go anywhere, and nothing happens as a result of it. Which is why we have so much power within our own agencies to kind of, like, we interact with all of these systems. We can hold all of these systems accountable we can be advocating for all of our clients in a way that's affirming and transformative, as opposed to perpetuating this like status quo and perpetuating the oppression that people experience in these systems. And there's also a lot of things we can do in terms of employment as well, where we can help people figure out different forms of employment where they might experience less discrimination. And there's been a lot of different strategies that are happening. Like at Chicago House, we do a lot of trainings with employers through our employment program to try to train employers on how to be more affirming. We also try to help people find employment that better matches like what they're looking for in terms of how they would feel comfortable. Then there's other orgs like Trans Tech Social that was founded by Angelica Ross, who some of you might know. She used to actually work at Chicago House and has been doing work in trans communities for many years, and she's now also a television star. But she started Trans Tech Social to really help trans folks learn how to do like graphic design and do computer-based work, because that's something that you can be self-employed while doing, and it's a skill you can do from home. It's a well-paying skill, and so there's a lot of cool, innovative things that are happening, but we have a long, long way to go. And then barriers to medical care, very similar to what we talked about earlier with the Tuskegee experiments, is that there are a lot of reasons why trans people do not feel affirmed in medical settings. For the longest time, there were transphobic standards of care that trans people had to adhere to even be allowed to transition. So what I mean by that is that people used to have to like live in the same, like they had to, one, be in a very binary understanding of gender, and then they also had to like wear the clothes and present themselves as that gender for like a certain number of time, for a certain length of time, I mean, before they were even allowed to engage in any sort of medical transitions, before they were even allowed to be put on hormone therapy. The medical community now, or many medical communities, including the American Medical Association, support this idea of informed consent models. And what this looks like is if somebody goes into, let's say, I'm going to use Howard Brown, for example, because they do a lot of trans healthcare, but so does Heartland, and then there's some private providers that do trans healthcare. But if I were to walk into Howard Brown and I were to say, I would like to go on hormones, I am trans, what they would do is they would, provide me with information and then allow me to make an informed decision, right? And, of course, like run my blood work and make sure that my liver values are okay, like as I'm moving through the process of like being on hormones and things like that. But there's like no hurdles that I would have to jump, right, to get prescribed hormones, no like significant hurdles. And then in terms of surgeries, a lot of people are still required to, you're often required to get like a letter from a therapist before you can get surgery still. So, and different surgeons have different protocols for that. But trans people have experienced discrimination and really like violence in the medical system for so long that a lot of trans people do not access care. And what that means also, when there aren't enough like trans affirming providers, and they're not accessing, and people don't feel comfortable accessing care, is that basic medical needs often go untreated. So just thinking differently about, like, not just thinking about like getting your transition like needs taken care of, but also just like diabetes, like the list goes on, like HIV care needs, cancer, right? I mean, all kinds of things that people might not get identified early because they're not engaged in healthcare. Or I had I had a friend who unfortunately passed away who was trans, who had a brain tumor. This is like hard to talk about, but when they went to the emergency room, they were told that the symptoms they were experiencing was probably because of the hormones they were on. There was no medical basis for somebody experiencing triple vision that would be related to their being trans or being on hormones. And this was at a highly, highly reputable, one of the best hospitals in the city of Chicago, that this is what was told to them, but they actually had an inoperable brain tumor. So I just like want to point that out, like that this really happens. Like this happens to people where their serious medical issues can go untreated due to barriers to medical care. And then this one, I think goes across many different identities, but I think this is true in terms of most people who are targeted by the criminal legal system in the United States, that there is a serious barrier to political participation. What we see is the disproportionate criminalization of many trans folks, primarily trans folks of color, and Black people in general, right, who suffer these collateral consequences as a result of criminal convictions and incarceration. So depending on like where you live, this is going to play out differently. Like in some states, once you have a felony, your right to vote is taken away from you, even after you're released from incarceration. Yet in some states, you can actually vote while you're incarcerated, right? So we do not have equity in our voting system at all in this country. And in Illinois, when you're incarcerated, you are barred from voting. Well, what we know about prisons in Illinois and in most places in the United States is that these prisons are primarily in white rural communities but most of the people that are locked in these cages are from Black and brown communities, right? And when you're locked up, you don't get to vote. Not only do you not get to vote to influence the political climate that we live in and the policies of our country, but you're counted, your actual physical body is counted in the census within the community that you're incarcerated in. So the rural communities that tend to not represent the interests of communities of color in urban areas are getting more representation in Congress based on the census, based on Black and brown bodies residing in their communities, right? And so this is the same for trans people. They don't get to, and we see an increased criminalization or disproportionate criminalization of trans women of color. I've had clients walking down the street with their groceries get arrested for prostitution when they literally were doing nothing, and then take a plea because they don't have the money to bond out, and they take a plea saying that they were engaged in sex work even when they weren't. And regardless of my views on whether sex work should be legal or not, that's somebody now who has a conviction, who is incarcerated, who is targeted by the police, right? And then who can't vote in her own best interest, potentially in the community that she's from, right? So these issues that we have are so deep. The white supremacy that exists is so insidious, and directly impacts the people that we have in office in our country. And this cyclical criminalization, the cyclical nature of all of these institutional oppression, of poverty and criminalization, is really an overall barrier to the liberation of trans people. And the way that I think is that if we can end the oppression of people that are the most oppressed in our country, then we can all be liberated, right? If we focus more on people with privilege, and we don't focus on the people who are experiencing the most oppression, then we'll never see that liberation in this country. So this is just a recap of all of the things that I was talking about just now. And I wanted to check in really quick with Torlin to see if there was any comments. I know I went on my soapbox there for a minute.
No, we're good, Avi.
Okay. So we're getting ready to wrap up here, y'all, just so that folks know. So I just want to do a recap, and then we're going to go through some quick action steps that for moving forward, and then take any like comments or questions. So just to go through this list again, that, you know, trans and gender nonconforming people, gender expansive people, particularly trans women of color, are really subjected to these higher rates of violence. And that's like through the outing, through police violence. There was a report done by Amnesty International, and I think it was released in, it was definitely sometime between 2000 and 2005. So now it's like 15, 20 years old. But at that time, 80% of the violence that was experienced in this huge report, it's called Stonewalled. So like it's a play on Stonewall, which was the uprising that was led by trans women of color in the East Village, or excuse me, in the West Village in New York, that really kicked off the modern LGBTQ rights movement. It's a play on that term, so, or on the name of that bar, so it's called Stonewalled. And they found that 80% of the violence experienced by LGBTQ people in this country was at the hands of law enforcement. So I want to really state that police violence is a huge issue when it comes to violence against trans people. Oftentimes trans women of color are charged with assaulting a police officer when they're being arrested. They get heightened charges, all kinds of things. So I could talk about that for a long time, but I will move on. We also see higher rates of violence, right, in educational settings from family members, foster care, group homes, prisons and jails and shelters. And then, so these are some of the ways that folks can be an ally, or some people like the term accomplice because it shows more action. It's a more action-oriented term, is that to not just add the T without doing the work. And what I mean by that is that, you know, I came up in a time when the T was being added, right? Like everybody started saying LGBT in the mid to late 90s. And a lot of these orgs that were predominantly orgs that were had people, white, cis, gay people in positions of power, added the T and then did nothing to uplift trans communities, and particularly trans communities of color. So once marriage equality passed, we've seen a lot of these orgs start to take up trans work, but it's really important that they center trans people in that work and that they don't do it just to try to get funding. And so how do we work to ensure that the voices of trans people, and particularly trans people of color, are leading these initiatives, right? So don't just add the T without doing the work. Listen to trans voices. You know, we should not make assumptions about what services or political actions are needed for members of trans communities. We should be really listening and centering and amplifying those voices, and listening to the needs of others. This is huge, just like it is within any community. We should never be relying on one trans person to inform or educate us about the needs of varying trans communities. What we know is that trans people come in all different types of political belief systems, just like everybody does, right? And if we relied on just one person from each community to represent the needs of that community, it's a disservice, right? So we really want to, we also don't want to place that burden on trans folks, right? So like if somebody's coming to me asking me every single question about what trans folks need, I'm going to just say like, hey, I'm one trans person. Like I can tell you my perspective, but also like I shouldn't have to educate you. Like we live in a time where there is such an access to information that we are actively making a choice to not educate ourselves if we are not educating ourselves. And I realize that some people have more capacity than others to take the time to do that, right? Like I want to acknowledge that some people are working 2 jobs and raising kids, and it's really hard. But we can even choose who we follow on social media, right? There's so many ways that we can learn about other communities and cultures. And then we really, really, really want to just continue to empower trans and gender expansive folks to lead the way. for their own communities. So we talked about this, educating yourself, researching organizations, reading books, articles, following people on social media, attending trainings and workshops like you're doing today, which is great. And I've seen most of you have persevered through this whole thing. I can actually see how many attendees are here, and for the most part, all of you have stayed the course. So high five to all of you. Thank you for sticking with me. Having discussion with other non-trans people about ways you can work against transphobia. Just as so many people are having conversations about racism right now, you know, like we can all be having these conversations with our communities and networks, and especially non-trans people, talking to your families, talking to your networks about the impact of all these systems on trans communities and trans communities of color. And then recognizing oppression as an intersection linking together racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, fat phobia. I could keep going. There's so many. But this is what we're talking about by intersectionality. We're talking about the intersection of all of these different isms, right? All of these different phobias and how they can all impact. All of these things can impact one person, right? That's a lot to deal with. That's a lot to have to shoulder, to move through the world, to access resources, to make it through educational systems, to make it through, to be successful in employment when you're constantly dealing with all of these outside forces, right, working against you. And some of that, the process of learning how to be an ally to trans folks includes understanding this intersectionality. And then once you've got a good handle on it, to really work to educate others, right? And how they can be better allies to folks in trans communities. And then if you feel like it's like you are perceiving this situation as being safe enough for you to interrupt transphobic behavior, then that would be an appropriate thing to do. I know that sometimes, like the same thing when I'm doing know your rights trainings on how to interact with the police, I'm never going to tell somebody that you should tell the police this or you should say that, right? Because you're in the moment. You're the one who knows how you feel in that moment and what your safety is in that moment and what your exposure to violence is in that moment. But when you feel like you can, being a good ally is interrupting, right? Oh, I went the wrong way. And then I wanted to just make a point in talking about all of the violence against trans people of color, that these are all the trans people in the United States that have been killed due to transphobic violence and police violence since New Year's Day. So, and this list evolves, and these are also the only ones that have been reported because people are so often misgendered when they die. And so we don't actually know the true number. So that's all I have for today. We did end up finishing about a half hour early, which is really cool. But I just wanted to open it up and see if anyone had any comments or questions.
So I have a couple of comments that I want to share. So it says, one says the mental health field also needs major changes. The DSM-5 has historically been transphobic and dangerous with their criteria. Gender variance is still considered as a psychiatric disease. Another comment that was made, any quick thoughts on healing from the oppression of transphobia, i.e. supportive, loving churches, positive social services that are not discriminating. And then it says, thank you for sharing and educating us. It's been an eye-opener for me. I was not aware of so much pronouns that people identify with, so that's going to be helpful. And then also, too, maybe as a follow-up, some additional handouts that you normally would share in a live session as it relates to pronouns or any other additional resources would be very helpful, so I can share with the attendees in a follow-up communication that are in our plug inside the LMS.
Yeah, I can forward, I can find some things to forward to Torlin
Sure. Yeah.
about pronouns.
And a big thanks from everyone. So everyone,
Great.
a big thanks for the presentation. So I wanted to share that.
I did want to follow up comment on the DSM comment and on the positive spaces. So I've thought a lot about the issues with the DSM 5, or I think we're at 5 now. And it's interesting because I think we have an interesting balance, and this is probably a much longer conversation, between not othering people with mental illness, which could then be considered ableist, and also still saying that just because you're trans doesn't mean that you have a mental illness. And I think that that's a really hard thing to navigate in terms of how to do that in a socially and politically responsible way, where we're not unintentionally oppressing people living with mental illness by trying to separate ourselves as trans people from them. And so, like, that having a mental illness is like automatically a negative thing. And so are we then stigmatizing mental illness by trying to separate ourselves as trans people from that? And that's something, like, theoretically that I've seriously been like just rolling around with in my head for many years, and I don't have the answer to it. But I did just want to complicate that piece because, right, there's inherently transphobia in the fact that trans people are in the DSM. But it's also, the DSM in general has a lot of problems. And so how do we advocate, like, simultaneously for trans people and for people with mental that may have a diagnosed mental illness, living with a mental illness, without creating more oppression, if that makes any sense. So I did want to comment on that. And then in terms of the positive spaces, there are definitely LGBTQ affirming churches and congregations, both in many different religious traditions in the city. And that's something you can probably Google. I mean, I don't have a compiled list, but like I know for like the Jewish congregation that I go to is an affirming space for trans people. But I know that there's quite a few churches there as well in the city. So I would recommend Googling that. And then there's also drop-in spaces and other community, there's support groups you can check out through. I know the Center on Halsted has quite a few support groups that people run out of that space. And then honestly, the thing about the pandemic world we're living in right now, one of the positive things that's come out of this is a lot more groups are forming online and going virtual. And so for folks that have that internet access, which unfortunately a lot of our clients don't, but for folks who do have access, there are some really great online communities that are forming as well. And now that you have a lot of this language and understand things, you might be able to tell which ones are really more affirming spaces. I think that's it. Any other last?
Nope. That's it. That's it. I just wanted to make a comment to everyone that's still in attendance. I put the actual link to the survey that's inside the chat, so you can take a look at that. If you can complete the feedback about today's presentation, I appreciate it. We have roughly over 80 people, so I'm looking forward to getting a lot of feedback about your experience today. So I just wanted to throw that pitch in. So the survey link is inside of the actual chat area so that you can support that. So I appreciate it.
And y'all, I'm writing, if you can see right here, I am writing in my email address at Chicago House. So you can always reach out to me with any follow-up questions. And I'm also going to put in the email for the name change mobilization at TJLP, just in case that's a resource that you would want to access as well. So you can reach me at my Chicago House address. You can email the name change mobilization directly. For any follow-up. Only email the name change about name change stuff specifically. Any other questions you have, you can shoot to my Chicago House email.
Okay, so Abby, what I can do is take this information and a follow-up communication. I can send it out to everyone so everyone can have it.
Great. Awesome.
Okay,
Thank
so if you share that with me, it'd be great. Okay?
Yeah. Mhm.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being a part of this today. It was great.
Avi, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And everyone, have a good rest of your day.
All right. Take care, everyone. Stay well out there.